My 30-year-old daughter was lying on the examination table, crying happy tears as she listened to her baby heartbeat. But the ultrasound technician, a doctor I had known for years, suddenly went dead pale. She slammed her hand against the power button, plunging the monitor into darkness, and rushed to deadbolt the heavy oak door. She pulled me aside, her hands shaking, and whispered, "You need to get her out of here right now. Get a divorce." When I looked at the hidden file she pulled up on her secondary screen, the chilling truth hit me like a freight train. My daughter was not carrying her husband-child. She had been trapped in a sick, twisted nightmare. Before I continue this terrifying story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn everything to the ground to protect the people you love. You are going to want to hear how I dismantled a billionaire family piece by piece. My name is Nadine. I am 55 years old, and for 30 years, I worked as a federal healthcare compliance auditor. I spent my entire career hunting down medical fraud for the government. I look at numbers, contracts, and hidden files, and I find the rotten core. But nothing could have prepared me for the pure evil hidden inside my own daughter's medical records. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Boston. I was sitting in the sterile, overly air-conditioned examination room of the Sterling Women Clinic. This was not just any clinic. It was a state-of-the-art, ultra-exclusive facility owned entirely by my son-in-law, wealthy, old-money family. My daughter, Kendra, lay on the examination table. At 30 years old, Kendra was a highly successful commercial real estate broker. She was beautiful, fiercely independent, and brilliant. But she was also completely blinded by love when she married Trenton Sterling. Trenton was 32, the heir to the Sterling Medical Group. He played the role of the rebellious, woke son who fought against his aristocratic family to marry the beautiful black woman he loved. His mother, Constance Sterling, made her disgust for Kendra obvious from day one. Constance was a terrifyingly polite Boston socialite obsessed with her family pure bloodline. But Trenton had sworn he would always protect my daughter. Kendra was 16 weeks pregnant. Trenton had insisted, almost demanded, that all her prenatal care be handled exclusively at his family flagship clinic. He claimed it was because they had the best doctors in the world. He kissed her forehead that morning and stepped out into the hallway to take a business call, leaving Kendra and me with Dr. Naomi Hayes. Dr. Hayes was a brilliant black female physician. She was the only reason Kendra felt comfortable in this cold, elitist building. Naomi smiled as she squirted the warm gel onto Kendra's slightly rounded stomach and pressed the ultrasound wand against her skin. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the heartbeat filled the room. Kendra squeezed my hand, her eyes welling with tears of pure joy. But as I looked up at Dr. Hayes, her smile completely vanished. I watched Naomi's eyes dart from the main ultrasound image to the secondary monitor where the patient data was displayed. The color completely drained from her face. Her hand, which had been perfectly steady a second ago, started to tremble violently. Without saying a word, she reached out and hit the power button on the main screen facing us. The heartbeat sound cut off instantly. The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. Before Kendra could even ask what was wrong, Naomi rushed to the heavy oak door of the examination room. She threw the deadbolt, flipped the privacy lock, and backed away from the door, her chest heaving as if she could not catch her breath. "What happened?" Kendra asked, her voice panicking as she tried to sit up. "Is the baby okay? Naomi, is there a heartbeat? Why did you turn it off?" Naomi did not answer Kendra. Instead, she grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it bruised, pulling me toward the corner of the room. She looked me dead in the eye, terror radiating from her face. "Nadine, you need to leave right now," Naomi whispered, her voice cracking. "Grab her clothes. Get her out the back exit. She needs to file for divorce today." My heart slammed against my ribs. I asked her what she was talking about. Naomi quickly typed a passcode into her secondary monitor and turned the screen toward me. She had bypassed the standard patient view and accessed the clinic's hidden back-end system. "Look right there," Naomi whispered, pointing a shaking finger at a red-flagged section in Kendra electronic file. I leaned in, my federal auditor eyes scanning the screen. I will never forget the words staring back at me. Patient status: Gestational carrier. Biological egg donor. Chloe Kensington. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. I read it again. Gestational carrier. That is the legal medical term for a surrogate. A woman carrying a baby that is not genetically hers. No, I said, shaking my head. That is a mistake. Kendra conceived naturally. Naomi shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. It is not a mistake, Nadine. The system flagged her blood work. I dug deeper. Trenton submitted legal paperwork to the clinic 3 months ago. Kendra is listed as a surrogate for an embryo created by Trenton and a woman named Chloe Kensington. Kendra, who had been listening from the examination table, let out a sound that I can only describe as a wounded animal. She scrambled off the table, wiping the gel from her stomach with shaking hands. "That is impossible!" Kendra cried out, tears streaming down her face. "We have been trying for a baby for a year. We conceived naturally. We conceived right after that routine fertility biopsy Trenton insisted I get. He said it was just to check my uterine lining. And just like that, 30 years of federal investigative experience clicked together in my brain like a horrifying puzzle. The routine biopsy. Trenton insisting she be put under light anesthesia at this exact clinic. Trenton demanding that his family doctors handle everything. Trenton managing all the legal paperwork for her medical consent forms. He drugged her. He put her under anesthesia for a fake biopsy, and while she was unconscious, he implanted an IVF embryo. He used my beautiful, successful daughter as a free, unwitting incubator for an embryo made with his sperm and a wealthy white socialite egg. Constance Sterling never accepted a black woman into their bloodline, so they bypassed her genetics entirely, turning her into a human vessel without her consent. They forged her signature on surrogacy documents to make it legally binding. A wave of pure, violent rage washed over me. I did not raise a victim, and I certainly did not raise a vessel for a bunch of racist, aristocratic psychopaths. Suddenly the handle of the heavy oak door rattled. Kendra flinched, backing away from the door. Naomi froze. "Babe!" Trenton's voice called out from the hallway, muffled but perfectly clear. The handle rattled again, more aggressively this time. "Hey, why's the door locked? Let me in. I want to see our baby." His voice, pretending to be the loving, excited father, made my stomach turn. He was standing right on the other side of that wood, a monster wearing a tailored suit. Naomi looked at me in absolute panic. "If he finds out I showed you this, they will destroy my medical license. They will ruin my life, Nadine." I looked at the doctor who had just risked everything to save my child. I reached over, hit print on the keyboard, and waited agonizing seconds for the single sheet of paper to slide out of the machine. I folded the proof of their unimaginable crime and shoved it deep into my purse. "I got you, Naomi," I whispered. "You were never here." "Babe!" Trenton shouted, pounding his fist against the door now. "Open the door! What is going on in there?" Kendra was hyperventilating, holding her stomach, staring at the door as if the devil himself was trying to break it down. I grabbed her clothes, throwing her shirt and pants at her. "Put these on right now," I ordered, my voice dropping into the cold, authoritative tone I used when raiding corrupt hospitals. "Do not make a sound." As Kendra frantically pulled her clothes on over her shaking body, I moved toward the back of the examination room. I knew these high-end clinics. They all had a private fire exit in the VIP suites to ensure wealthy clients could leave without being seen by the public. I pushed the heavy curtain aside, revealing the heavy red emergency exit door. Trenton was slamming his shoulder against the main door now. "Someone get a key!" he yelled down the hallway. "Something is wrong with my wife! Get a key right now!" I grabbed Kendra by the arm. She was sobbing silently, completely shattered by the betrayal of the man she loved. I pulled her through the fire exit door into the narrow concrete stairwell. The heavy door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the sound of Trenton pounding on the exam room door. But I knew Trenton would figure it out the second he got inside that room. He would know we ran. He would send his private security to lock down the parking garage before we could even reach my car. I needed a distraction, a massive one. I looked at the red fire alarm pull station on the concrete wall of the stairwell. I did not even hesitate. I grabbed the handle and yanked it down as hard as I could. Instantly, a deafening siren erupted throughout the entire building. Strobe lights began flashing violently in the stairwell. The automated voice of the emergency system began blaring over the loudspeakers, ordering a total evacuation of the Sterling Women Clinic. "Come on!" I yelled over the blaring siren, pulling my daughter down the concrete stairs as fast as her legs could carry her. We burst out of the ground floor exit into the rainy alley behind the clinic. Doctors, nurses, and wealthy patients were already pouring out of the main entrance, creating a sea of absolute chaos and confusion. Sirens from approaching fire trucks began wailing in the distance, mixing with the clinic alarms. I pushed Kendra into the passenger seat of my sedan, slammed the door, and got behind the wheel. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the war that had just begun. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the alley, blending into the panicked Boston traffic. Kendra curled into a ball in the passenger seat, weeping uncontrollably, her hands wrapped protectively around a stomach that held a child that was not hers. She looked at me, her eyes completely broken. "Mom!" she choked out. "What are we going to do?" I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I looked at my daughter, my brilliant, beautiful girl who had been reduced to a pawn by a family of monsters. "We are going to disappear," I said, my voice cold and steady, "and then we are going to take everything they have." The drive from the clinic back to Kendra House was a blur of rain and panicked silence. I kept my eyes locked on the road, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure none of Trenton's private security vehicles were tailing us. Kendra sat beside me, trembling, holding her stomach. She stared blankly out the passenger window, her world completely shattered. When we finally pulled into the driveway of her sprawling suburban home, my federal auditor instincts were screaming at me that this was a terrible idea. We needed to be halfway across state lines by now. But Kendra insisted she needed her passport, her laptop, and enough clothes to disappear. As we hurried up the cobblestone walkway, the sheer injustice of the situation made my blood boil. Kendra had purchased this house with her own money. She was the one who worked 80-hour weeks closing massive commercial real estate deals. She paid the massive mortgage every single month. But when they got married, Trenton had convinced her to let his family trust handle the closing documents. He claimed it would save them hundreds of thousands in property taxes. In reality, it meant the deed was locked inside the Sterling family legal labyrinth. He had effectively trapped her in a home she paid for, but technically did not own. That was how the Sterlings operated. They isolated you financially, then controlled every aspect of your life. We pushed through the heavy oak front door, and the house was dead silent. I locked the deadbolt behind us and told Kendra we had exactly 10 minutes before Trenton figured out where we went. We rushed up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. Kendra pulled a large suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes into it indiscriminately. Sweaters, pants, shoes, she did not even look at what she was packing. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped a stack of shirts onto the hardwood floor. I crouched down beside her, grabbing her shoulders to steady her. I told her to breathe and focus. We needed her financial documents, her banking tokens, and every piece of identification she had. We were dealing with billionaires who could freeze accounts with a single phone call. Kendra nodded, tears silently streaming down her face as she moved toward the heavy wooden dresser where they kept their important files. The room was cast in deep shadows from the storm outside, the heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I kept glancing at the bedroom door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knew Trenton. I knew how these arrogant, entitled men operated. They never panicked. They calculated. And right then, a cold sinking feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I told Kendra to hurry up. She grabbed her passport and turned back toward the suitcase. And then a voice echoed from the darkest corner of the room. "You really should not be moving around so fast, Kendra. It is not good for the baby." Kendra gasped and dropped her passport. I spun around, my heart stopping cold. Sitting in the velvet armchair by the window, completely obscured by the shadows, was Trenton. He had not chased us out of the clinic. He had simply driven straight home and waited for us in the dark, knowing exactly where we would go. He slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit. His face was a mask of perfect calm. The fake, woke, supportive husband persona was fully engaged. "Why did you run away, babe?" he asked, his voice dripping with faux concern. You really scared me. I was talking to the receptionist and suddenly the fire alarm went off and you were just gone. Dr. Hayes said you had a panic attack. Are your pregnancy hormones making you paranoid again? The absolute audacity of this man made my vision blur with rage. He took a slow, deliberate step toward my daughter, holding his hands up like he was trying to calm a frightened animal. Kendra backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. "Stay away from me," she choked out. Trenton stopped and let out a soft, condescending sigh. He looked at me with a sad, pitying expression. "Nadine, please talk some sense into your daughter. She is under a lot of stress. Pregnancy can do terrible things to a woman's mental state. The hormonal imbalances can cause severe delusions and paranoia. She needs to be back at the clinic where my family specialist can take proper care of her. If she keeps acting this erratic, she could hurt our child." My fists clenched at my sides. I had interrogated mob bosses and corrupt politicians who had more humanity than the man standing in front of me. "Do not you dare talk to me about her mental state," I snapped. "We know exactly what you did, Trenton." The mask of concern on his face did not slip. It just tightened. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Nadine," he said, his tone entirely too even. "Kendra is my wife. I love her. I am just trying to protect our family." Kendra let out a bitter, broken laugh. Her fear was suddenly giving way to a profound, explosive anger. "Love me!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You love me. You put me under anesthesia for a fake biopsy. You drugged me, Trenton. You implanted another woman embryo inside of me without my permission." Trenton simply tilted his head, his eyes dark and empty. "Sweetheart, you are not making any sense right now. You need to sit down. You are having a psychological break. We know about the file, Trenton," I said, stepping between him and my daughter. "I saw the hidden medical records, gestational carrier, biological egg donor Chloe Kensington. You forged her signature on surrogacy documents. You turned my daughter into a human incubator for your racist family because your mother would never let a black woman bloodline mix with yours." For a long, agonizing moment, the room was dead silent. The only sound was the heavy rain pounding against the glass. Trenton looked at me, and then he looked at Kendra. Slowly, the concerned husband act melted away completely. The soft wrinkles around his eyes vanished. His posture straightened and his shoulders squared. The warm blue eyes that Kendra had fallen in love with turned as cold and dead as a shark. He let out a low, dark chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand up. He slowly walked over to the mahogany nightstand and picked up a silver picture frame. It was a photo of their wedding day. He stared at it for a moment before casually tossing it onto the bed. "You both have incredibly active imaginations," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "Do you really think anyone is going to believe this insane conspiracy theory? Look at me, Nadine. I am the CEO of the most prestigious medical group in New England. My family name is on wings of hospitals across the country. And who are you? A retired government pencil pusher. And Kendra is an emotional pregnant woman with a documented history of anxiety. I have 5 different psychiatrists on my payroll who will gladly sign affidavits stating that Kendra is suffering from severe prenatal psychosis. You ran out of a medical facility, triggered a false fire alarm, and fled the scene. You are acting like lunatics." Kendra shook her head, tears flying from her cheeks. "I will tell the police. I will go to the press. I will tell everyone what you did to me." Trenton laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Tell them what, Kendra? That you voluntarily signed a surrogacy agreement. The paperwork is ironclad. My family lawyers made sure of it. Your signature is on every single page. It is notarized. It is legally binding in the state of Massachusetts. You agreed to carry my and Chloe child because you were infertile. That is the story. That is the legal reality. You are just having buyer remorse now." "You forged my signature," she screamed, clutching her stomach. "I never signed anything. Proving forgery costs millions of dollars in legal fees." "Kendra," he replied, taking another step closer, "do you have millions of dollars right now? Because if I make one phone call, your business accounts will be frozen pending a competency hearing. You will have nothing. No money, no house, no credibility. You are standing in a house owned by my family trust. You are wearing clothes bought with my money. You have absolutely no leverage here." He was trying to suffocate her with his power. He wanted her to feel so small and so trapped that she would just give up and submit to his control. I watched him systematically dismantling my daughter's confidence, playing on every fear a pregnant woman could possibly have. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You are carrying a Sterling," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice and ownership. "You do not leave until I say so. You belong to me until that baby is born." He reached out to grab Kendra's arm. He never even saw my hand move. I reached into the waistband of my slacks and pulled my legally registered concealed carry weapon, leveling the dark steel barrel directly at his chest. I clicked the safety off, and the metallic snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Trenton froze instantly, his hand hovering in midair. His arrogant smile completely vanished, replaced by genuine shock. "Step back from my daughter," I commanded, my voice as cold and hard as the weapon in my hands, "or I swear to God I will drop you right here on your own hardwood floor." Trenton slowly raised his hands, his eyes locked on the barrel of the gun. "You are crazy, Nadine," he muttered, but he took a cautious step backward, giving us the space we needed. He realized in that moment I was not playing by his wealthy elite rules. "Pick up the bag, Kendra," I said, never taking my eyes off him. "We are leaving right now." Kendra grabbed her suitcase and rushed out the bedroom door. I backed out slowly, keeping the weapon trained on him until I cleared the hallway. We had survived the ambush, but the real war with the Sterling family had just begun. We drove through the blinding rain for another hour, making sure we took every back road and side street I could think of. I knew Trenton would have his security team scouring the main highways looking for my car. I finally pulled into the crumbling parking lot of a dilapidated roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly yellow light across the wet pavement. It was exactly the kind of place we needed, a place that did not ask for identification and only accepted cash. I walked into the cramped lobby, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. I handed the clerk a wad of bills and took the heavy brass key for room number 12. We carried Kendra's suitcase into the dingy room, locking the flimsy door behind us. I shoved the heavy wooden dresser against the doorframe for extra security. Kendra collapsed onto the lumpy mattress, pulling her knees to her chest. She did not cry anymore. The shock had burned away, leaving a hollow, devastating silence in its wake. I sat in the faded armchair by the window, keeping watch through a crack in the curtains while the rain continued to hammer against the glass. Neither of us slept a single minute that night. Every time a car drove past the motel, my heart jumped into my throat. But the morning light eventually broke through the heavy clouds, bringing a false sense of safety. Kendra sat up and pulled her laptop from her bag. Her face was pale and drawn, but the fierce determination that made her a top real estate broker was slowly returning to her eyes. She told me we needed money to fight them. She had over $2 million sitting in her business accounts from her recent commercial property closures. She logged on to her secure banking portal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She planned to wire the entire balance into an offshore account I had set up years ago during an undercover investigation. It was untraceable and completely disconnected from the Sterling family reach. She clicked the transfer button, and a small loading circle appeared on the screen. We both held our breath, waiting for the confirmation screen that would give us the resources we needed to disappear and hire the best federal lawyers in the country. We watched the little circle spin and spin. It felt like an eternity. And then the screen flashed red. An error message popped up in bold letters. "Transaction denied. Please contact your branch manager immediately." Kendra frowned and tried again. She retyped the account numbers, double-checking every single digit. She hit submit again. The same red error message appeared on the screen. Panic began to set in. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed her private wealth manager at the bank. The phone rang twice before a customer service representative answered. It was not her usual manager. It was a cold, automated voice telling her that she had been routed to the legal compliance department. A woman came on the line, her tone incredibly stiff and formal. Kendra demanded to know why her wire transfer was blocked. The woman cleared her throat and asked Kendra to verify her identity. After Kendra answered all the security questions, the woman delivered a blow that knocked the wind completely out of us. "I am sorry, Mrs. Sterling," the woman said, her voice entirely devoid of empathy. "But your accounts have been temporarily frozen pending a legal review." Kendra gripped the phone, her knuckles turning white. She told the woman there had to be a mistake. She explained that she was the sole owner of the business account and her husband had no legal authority over her corporate funds. The woman on the other end of the line sighed softly. The woman explained that the freeze was not initiated by a standard banking error. It was a court-ordered hold submitted by the legal team representing Trenton Sterling. Kendra's voice shook as she asked how Trenton could possibly freeze accounts that predated their marriage. The woman read from a digital file, explaining that Trenton had invoked a specific clause in their prenuptial agreement, a medical incapacitation clause. I snatched the phone from Kendra's hand and put it on speaker. I demanded to know exactly what the document said. The woman hesitated, but my tone left her no room for argument. She read the legal jargon out loud. The clause stated that if Kendra suffered a severe mental health crisis that rendered her incapable of making rational financial decisions, her husband would be granted emergency power of attorney over all her assets, including her independent business accounts. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The woman continued reading, stating that Trenton had provided the bank with signed affidavits from 3 different board-certified psychiatrists. The documents claimed that Kendra was currently suffering from severe pregnancy psychosis. The doctors alleged that she was experiencing dangerous paranoid delusions and was a flight risk who might squander her assets in a state of mania. The bank had no choice but to comply with the emergency injunction to protect the estate. The freeze was absolute. Kendra could not withdraw a single dollar. She could not sell her properties. She could not even use her credit cards to buy a cup of coffee. The line went dead. The silence in the dingy motel room was suffocating. Trenton had not just anticipated our escape. He had systematically dismantled our ability to survive. He used his wealth and his medical connections to build an invisible cage around my daughter. He weaponized the very system that was supposed to protect her. By labeling her as mentally unstable, he stripped away her autonomy, her credibility, and her financial independence, all without her ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. Kendra stared at the blank laptop screen, her breathing shallow and rapid. She realized she was completely trapped. Every dollar she had earned through years of grueling work was now controlled by the man who had violated her body. The sheer cruelty of his strategy was staggering. He knew we could not run without money. He knew we could not hire high-powered attorneys without a massive retainer. He was starving us out. He wanted to make us so desperate and so destitute that returning to his mansion would be our only option for survival. I paced the worn carpet of the motel room, my mind racing through federal financial regulations, looking for a loophole. But Trenton family lawyers were the best money could buy. They had drafted a prenuptial agreement filled with landmines disguised as standard protective clauses. He had smiled in her face and promised her the world while slipping a financial noose around her neck. He was not just a manipulative husband. He was a sociopath with unlimited resources. I looked at Kendra sitting on the edge of the bed, looking so small and defeated. I walked over and took her face in my hands. I told her we were not going to give up. I reminded her that I had spent 3 decades tracking down hidden assets for the government. I knew how to navigate the darkest corners of the financial system. We did not need her bank accounts right now. We just needed time to gather the evidence to destroy him. Before Kendra could say another word, my pocket began to vibrate. It was not my regular cell phone. I had destroyed both of our personal phones the second we left the house to avoid being tracked by GPS. It was the prepaid burner phone I had purchased at a gas station along the highway. Only one person in the world could possibly have this number. I pulled the cheap plastic device from my pocket and stared at the unknown caller ID. My blood ran cold. I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear without speaking. A smooth, aristocratic voice echoed through the cheap speaker. It was Constance Sterling, Trenton mother. Her tone was eerily calm, sounding more like a woman ordering afternoon tea than a monster hunting human prey. "You are making a very messy situation much worse, Nadine." She murmured her words perfectly enunciated. "You thought you could hide from us, but we have resources you cannot even comprehend. We practically own this city from the judges down to the local police departments. You are completely outmatched. Bring my grandchild incubator back to our estate right now. If that girl is not back in her bed by noon, I will have the police kick down your door and I will have your daughter permanently committed to a psychiatric ward. The choice is yours." I listened to the dial tone echoing in my ear, a heavy silence filling the tiny room. We had no money, and the walls were rapidly closing in on both of us. I stared at the cheap plastic burner phone in my hand long after Constance Sterling hung up. The silence in the dingy motel room felt heavy, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the calm before the storm. Kendra looked at me, her eyes wide and terrified, waiting to see if I would crack under the pressure of a billionaire threat. I tossed the phone onto the faded bedspread and let out a short, bitter laugh. Constance thought she could intimidate a woman who had spent 30 years dismantling corporate crime syndicates for the federal government. She thought because she had unlimited money, she was entirely invincible. But money always leaves a paper trail, and nobody was better at following a trail than me. I told Kendra to wipe her tears. We were not going back to that mansion, and we were certainly not surrendering her child to that monstrous family. I opened my encrypted laptop, the one I used during my active duty days, and connected it to a secure offshore server. I needed a backdoor into the Sterling Medical Group network, but I could not risk triggering their internal cybersecurity alarms. I needed someone on the inside of the federal database who could mask my digital footprint. I dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. It belonged to Marcus, an old colleague at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division. Marcus and I had worked together on a massive healthcare fraud case back in 2015. I saved his career when a corrupt senator tried to frame him, and he owed me a debt he swore he would repay whenever I asked. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was deep and cautious, asking why a retired auditor was calling him on a scrambled line. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my daughter was in grave danger, and I needed a ghost proxy to bypass a high-level corporate firewall. Marcus hesitated, warning me that if we got caught, we would both be facing federal prison time. I told him the target was the Sterling Medical Group. I heard him exhale sharply over the line. The Sterlings were untouchable, heavily politically connected, and notoriously ruthless. But Marcus knew me. He knew I would not make this kind of request unless it was a matter of life or death. He agreed to give me a 20-minute window of absolute digital invisibility using a ghost server he maintained for undercover operations. He gave me the internet protocol address and the encryption keys, then wished me luck before severing the connection. I looked at Kendra. I told her I was about to commit a major federal felony, but it was the only way to get the evidence we needed to destroy Trenton and his mother. She nodded, her face hardening with newfound resolve. I cracked my knuckles and began typing. During my time at the agency, I had conducted a routine compliance audit on the Sterling clinics. They thought I was just checking billing codes, but I had quietly memorized their back-end administrative access protocols. Corporate arrogance is a funny thing. Billionaires spend millions on front-facing security, but they never bother to update their legacy administrative passwords because they think no one would dare look behind the curtain. Within 5 minutes, I bypassed their secondary firewall. I was officially inside the main server of the Sterling Medical Group. The amount of data scrolling across my screen was staggering. Thousands of patient files, financial ledgers, and confidential email chains moving rapidly before my eyes. I ran a targeted search using my daughter name and Trenton administrative credentials. I needed the original unedited medical records from the day of Kendra's supposed fertility biopsy. The system processed the request, and a hidden encrypted folder popped up on my screen. I cracked the folder open and began reading the internal communications between Trenton and the clinic chief of medicine. My stomach turned with every single word. Trenton had explicitly ordered the medical team to sedate Kendra under the guise of a routine preventative procedure. While she was unconscious, they implanted an embryo that had been fertilized in their private laboratory 2 days prior. But I needed to know the origin of the embryo. I needed the financial transaction that proved this was a premeditated crime orchestrated by the Sterling family. I switched my search parameters from medical files to the family private trust ledgers. I looked for any massive outflows of cash corresponding to the dates surrounding the implantation procedure. It did not take long to find exactly what I was looking for. There was a wire transfer executed by Constance Sterling directly from her personal offshore account. The amount was exactly $500,000. The recipient was a private shell company called Kensington Holdings. I ran a quick cross-reference on the shell company and found the sole proprietor, Chloe Kensington. She was a 26-year-old blonde, blue-eyed socialite from one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. She was a woman Constance Sterling deemed genetically worthy of carrying on the Sterling bloodline. I opened the attached legal contract, and the sheer evil of the document made me gasp out loud in the quiet motel room. It was a private genetic acquisition agreement. Chloe Kensington had sold her eggs to the Sterling family for $500,000. The contract explicitly stated that she relinquished all maternal rights, but it also included a terrifying clause. The Sterling family guaranteed that Chloe would not have to endure the physical burden of pregnancy or childbirth. The contract promised that a suitable third-party gestational carrier would be provided by the Sterling Medical Group at no additional cost or liability to the donor. Constance and Trenton had purchased a wealthy white woman genetics and used my beautiful black daughter as a free disposable incubator. They bypassed the physical toll of pregnancy for the woman they respected while placing all the medical risks squarely on the woman they despised. Kendra read the contract over my shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as the reality set in. She realized she was never a wife to Trenton. She was just a biological vessel, a legal loophole they exploited to get their perfect heir without inconveniencing a woman of their own social standing. The depth of their racism and misogyny was entirely woven into their financial documents, meticulously planned and executed by a team of highly paid lawyers and corrupt doctors. Kendra placed her hand over her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to tear her apart. All those romantic dinners, all those whispered promises about building a family together were nothing but a calculated performance. Trenton had looked into her eyes and told her he loved her while actively planning to erase her from her own child life. It was a level of psychological torture I had never encountered in all my years of federal service. I reached up and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly, to remind her she was not alone in this fight. I promised myself right then that Trenton Sterling would spend the rest of his miserable life rotting in a federal prison cell. I downloaded every single page of the contract, the wire transfer receipts, and the internal emails onto my encrypted flash drive. We finally had the undeniable proof we needed to go to the authorities and clear Kendra's name. But as the progress bar slowly filled across my screen, my eyes caught something else hidden in the directory. The payment to Chloe Kensington was not an isolated file. It was sitting inside a master folder labeled Project Vessel. My federal auditor instincts flared up instantly. You do not name a folder Project Vessel for a one-time transaction involving a family member. I clicked on the master folder and my heart completely stopped. The screen populated with dozens of subfolders. Each folder was labeled with a different patient identification number. I opened the first one. It contained the medical records of a 22-year-old Hispanic college student who had gone to a Sterling clinic for a free reproductive health screening. I opened another folder. A 19-year-old black woman from a low-income neighborhood who had sought treatment for severe endometriosis. Folder after folder, file after file. I scrolled through 47 different names. Every single one of them was a young, healthy minority woman who had gone to the Sterling Medical Group for basic medical care or routine surgeries. And every single one of them had a hidden file flag identical to Kendra. Gestational carrier. The Sterlings had not just done this to my daughter. They were running a massive illegal eugenics and surrogacy trafficking ring right out of their pristine corporate medical clinics. They were harvesting eggs from wealthy white society women and secretly implanting them into unsuspecting minority women during routine charitable surgeries. They used their billions to cover up the pregnancies, claiming they were miraculous natural conceptions, then found legal or medical ways to seize the babies once they were born by declaring the mothers unfit or orchestrating tragic accidents. My daughter was not just a victim of a cruel husband. She was patient number 48 in a systemic medical horror show that had been operating for years under the radar of the federal government. I stared at the screen, the sheer scale of the evil threatening to completely suffocate me. Trenton and Constance were not just trying to steal Kendra Baby for their own selfish legacy. They were operating a human farming operation catering to the ultra-wealthy elite who wanted pure-blooded children without ruining their own bodies. And if we did not stop them, nobody would ever know the truth. I looked at Kendra, her face pale with absolute horror as she realized the magnitude of her husband's crimes. "We are not just saving you anymore," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. "We are bringing down their entire empire." While I was sitting in that dingy motel room downloading the massive files that would ultimately destroy the Sterling family, Kendra made a decision that would forever change her life. She could not just sit there in the dark waiting for me to build a federal case. She needed to see the woman who had bought her husband and stolen her future. She knew Trenton's schedule better than anyone. Every Thursday afternoon, he played golf at the ultra-exclusive Oakwood Country Club. It was a place dripping with old money and unearned privilege. Kendra grabbed the keys to my sedan and pulled a dark, oversized hoodie over her head, slipping on a pair of large, dark sunglasses. She drove through the heavy, pouring rain, her knuckles turning pure white on the steering wheel. Her heart was pounding inside her chest with a mixture of absolute terror and overwhelming righteous rage. When she arrived at the wrought iron gates of the massive country club, she bypassed the heavily guarded main entrance and parked near the delivery service bays in the back. She walked onto the pristine grounds, keeping her head down, blending in perfectly with the catering staff who were busy setting up for an evening charity event. The rain had finally cleared, leaving a thick, humid, suffocating heat hanging heavy in the air. Kendra navigated the manicured stone pathways, her eyes frantically scanning the sprawling outdoor terrace overlooking the 18th hole. She finally spotted him. Trenton was sitting alone at a secluded table in the far corner of the stone patio, wearing a crisp white designer polo shirt and a perfectly tailored linen jacket. He looked incredibly relaxed, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just destroyed his wife's life only hours earlier. Kendra felt a violent wave of nausea wash over her entire body. She hid behind a thick wall of tall, manicured hedges, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as she watched him. A few moments later, a woman approached his table. It was Chloe Kensington. She was exactly what my daughter was not. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, pale skin, and the effortless arrogance of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She was wearing a custom designer sundress that cost more than most working people made in an entire month. Trenton stood up immediately as she approached. He did not just greet her with a polite professional hug. He pulled her close and kissed her deeply, his hands resting intimately on her waist. The physical betrayal hit Kendra so hard she almost collapsed right there in the wet bushes. He had told Kendra he was working late, all those nights she spent alone in their massive empty house, decorating the nursery for a baby she thought they had created together. He had been with Chloe the entire time, playing house with the woman he truly respected. Kendra gripped the prickly branches of the hedge, forcing herself to stay upright, despite the dizzying pain in her head. She watched as Trenton pulled out a chair for Chloe, treating her with a level of reverence and gentle respect he had never once shown my daughter. A waiter immediately brought them a bottle of incredibly expensive champagne, pouring 2 tall crystal glasses. Kendra felt her blood boil as she watched them toast, smiling and laughing happily together, like they did not have a single care in the world. They were celebrating their twisted victory, while my pregnant daughter was hiding in a cheap roadside motel, stripped of her finances and her basic human dignity. Trenton reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. He slid them across the glass table directly toward Chloe. Even from a distance, Kendra could see the official gold seals of the Sterling Medical Group printed clearly on the covers. These were the finalized legal documents transferring all parental rights entirely over to Chloe. Kendra crept a few inches closer, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. She needed to hear exactly what they were saying. The outdoor patio was relatively empty, and the afternoon wind carried their voices directly toward the hedges where she was hiding. Trenton leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice smooth and horribly confident. He told Chloe that everything was proceeding exactly as they had meticulously planned. He assured her that the hospital medical board was fully controlled by his family, and the surrogate was currently being managed without any major issues. Kendra's stomach turned violently at the casual use of the word surrogate. That was all she was to him. A temporary inconvenience necessary to deliver his perfect genetically pure heir. Chloe took a delicate sip of her champagne, leaving a faint red lipstick mark on the crystal rim. She smiled, setting the glass down and trailing her manicured fingers across the heavy legal documents. She asked Trenton what would happen if Kendra tried to go to the police or the media before the baby was born. Trenton let out a soft, arrogant chuckle, shaking his head, as if the very idea was completely ridiculous. He reached across the table and took Chloe's hand, rubbing his thumb softly over her knuckles. He told her not to worry about my daughter at all. He said he had already laid the permanent legal groundwork with 5 different board-certified psychiatrists who were firmly on his family payroll. He explained his horrific plan in meticulous detail to the woman sitting across from him. He told Chloe they were going to legally induce labor early, right at the 8-month mark. He said it would be done securely at their private, off-the-grid surgical center, where no outside doctors or nurses could ever interfere with the delivery. Once the baby was safely delivered and handed directly over to Chloe, he was going to finalize the medical incapacitation paperwork immediately. Kendra clamped her hand hard over her mouth, tears streaming hot and fast down her cheeks. Trenton looked Chloe dead in the eye and promised her that Kendra would never be a problem for their new family. He said he was going to have her permanently committed to the secure psychiatric wing of the Sterling Family Flagship Hospital. He claimed she would be diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis and kept heavily medicated in a locked ward for the rest of her natural life. He said the rest of the world would just view it as a tragic medical outcome for a mentally unstable woman. Chloe did not look horrified by this monstrous plan. She did not express a single ounce of guilt or basic human empathy for the innocent woman carrying her biological child. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed a bright musical sound that cut through the humid afternoon air like a sharp razor blade. She told Trenton he was incredibly brilliant and raised her glass for another cheerful toast to their bright future together. Kendra could not listen to another word. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so violently she truly thought it might break right through her chest. The man she had deeply loved, the man she had sworn to spend the rest of her life with before God was casually planning to imprison her forever. She slowly backed away from the hedge, her vision completely blurring with a mixture of absolute terror and righteous screaming fury. She needed to get back to me immediately. She needed to make sure I had the federal evidence totally secured so we could burn their entire medical operation to the ground before they could trap her in their hospital prison. She turned around and practically sprinted across the perfectly manicured green lawn, heading straight toward the parking lot where she had left my vehicle. Kendra reached the edge of the large parking lot, her chest heaving heavily as she fumbled in her pocket for the car keys. The sprawling lot was filled with luxury vehicles gleaming brightly in the afternoon sun. She just wanted to get inside the car and lock the heavy doors. But as she rounded the corner of a massive black sport utility vehicle, she stopped dead in her tracks. Chloe Kensington was walking directly toward her. Chloe had apparently left the patio table to retrieve something from her luxury car. For one terrifying, endless second, the two women simply stood there, staring at each other across the hot, black asphalt. Kendra froze, entirely paralyzed by fear, fully expecting Chloe to scream for country club security or call Trenton on her cell phone. But Chloe did not scream. She did not reach into her designer purse for her phone. She stood perfectly still, her cold blue eyes raking up and down Kendra, pregnant body taking in the oversized wet hoodie and the tear-stained, terrified face. The wealthy blonde socialite tilted her head slightly, her beautiful expression completely devoid of any human warmth or compassion. A slow, chilling, evil smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She looked directly into my daughter's eyes and silently mouthed 5 devastating words. "Thank you for your service." Chloe turned smoothly on her heel and walked away, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, leaving Kendra standing completely alone in the parking lot, entirely shattered by the pure, unadulterated evil she had just witnessed. Kendra threw herself blindly into the driver's seat of my sedan, locking all the doors instantly. She started the engine and tore out of the country club parking lot, her tires squealing loudly against the wet asphalt. She drove back to our dingy roadside motel like an absolute maniac, her hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. Her mind was racing frantically, replaying the horrific conversation she had just overheard between Trenton and Chloe. They were not just going to steal her innocent baby, they were going to steal her entire life, lock her in a padded white room, and throw away the key forever. When she finally reached the motel, she slammed the car into park and sprinted across the cracked pavement toward room number 12. She pounded heavily on the door until I opened it. Kendra collapsed heavily into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably, hyperventilating wildly as she told me everything she had just seen and heard at the exclusive country club. She told me about the intimate kiss, the forged legal documents, and the terrifying plan to induce her labor early and commit her to a psychiatric ward forever. She told me about the cold, dead look in Chloe's eyes when she thanked her for her service. I felt a cold, murderous rage settle deep into my very bones. I held my daughter tightly, smoothing her hair and telling her that those monsters were never going to lay another finger on her. I walked over to the desk and pulled the encrypted flash drive from my laptop, holding it up directly for her to see. I told her I had absolutely everything we needed to destroy them. The massive wire transfers, the forged medical contracts, the hidden patient files, proving they had done this exact same thing to dozens of other vulnerable minority women. I told Kendra we needed to pack our bags immediately. Trenton and Constance had far too much power and money in this city, and we could not stay in one place for too long without being discovered. We needed to drive across state lines immediately and take the hard evidence directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in New York, where their local political connections could not protect them anymore. Kendra wiped her swollen eyes and grabbed her suitcase, throwing her remaining clothes inside with a frantic, desperate energy. We moved quickly together, grabbing our phone chargers, the prepaid burner phone, and the crucial financial documents we had managed to save from the house. I zipped my black laptop bag shut and checked the deadbolt on the motel door one last time. We were so incredibly close to getting out. We were mere minutes away from completely turning the tables on the Sterling family empire. But the billionaires always have eyes everywhere in this town. As I reached for the brass handle of the motel door, the dark room was suddenly flooded with bright, flashing red and blue lights, piercing violently through the thin, cheap curtains. The piercing, deafening wail of multiple police sirens filled the air completely surrounding our tiny unit. Kendra dropped her heavy suitcase, the loud thud echoing ominously in the small room. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. I moved quickly to the window and peeked cautiously through a small gap in the curtains. There were at least 4 local police cruisers, parked aggressively in a tight semicircle, blocking my sedan completely from leaving. 2 white emergency ambulances were idling right behind the cruisers, their intense strobe lights painting the motel walls in erratic bursts of blinding color. Heavily armed police officers were stepping quickly out of their vehicles, unholstering their service weapons, and moving in a tight tactical formation directly toward room 12. My blood ran completely ice-cold. Trenton had somehow tracked us and found us. A heavy, massive fist began pounding violently against the flimsy wooden door, rattling the frame violently. "Police open up right now," a deep, aggressive voice commanded, echoing loudly over the blare of the sirens. "Open this door immediately, or we will breach the room." Kendra grabbed my arm, crying hysterically, begging me not to let them take her back to the Sterling hospital. I told her to get behind me and stay completely quiet no matter what happened next. Before I could even reach the lock, the officers kicked the door open with a deafening crash, splintering the cheap wood and breaking the deadbolt clean off the frame. 4 heavily armed police officers rushed into the tiny room, shining blinding tactical flashlights directly into our faces. Right behind them, 2 large paramedics pushed their way inside, carrying a heavy medical bag and a thick leather straitjacket. And then walking casually behind the solid wall of uniforms was Trenton. He was still wearing the pristine white polo shirt from the country club, not a single hair out of place. He looked around the dingy motel room with an expression of deep theatrical sorrow. He stepped forward, looking at the lead police officer with a perfectly crafted look of desperation and worry. "Thank God you finally found her, officer," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "She has been completely missing since yesterday morning. She is suffering from a severe prenatal psychotic break. She stole a vehicle and fled our medical facility while having delusions." The lead officer nodded sympathetically and held up a thick official stack of paperwork. It was a formal 5150 involuntary psychiatric hold signed by a corrupt state judge and backed by the fake medical records Trenton had manufactured. The officer looked sternly at Kendra and told her she needed to come with them peacefully right now for a mandatory mental health evaluation. He said they had a legal court order declaring her an active danger to herself and her unborn child. Trenton took a slow step toward Kendra, holding his hand out like a loving, worried husband. "Come on, sweetheart," he cooed softly, playing his part perfectly. "It is time to go back home. You need your daily medication. We are going to take such good care of you at the clinic." The paramedic stepped forward, pulling out heavy leather restraints, preparing to strap my pregnant daughter onto a medical stretcher, completely against her will. Kendra screamed a raw, terrifying sound and pressed herself flat against the back wall of the room. They were going to kidnap her legally, using the local police as their own private security force. Trenton smiled a tiny, microscopic smile, knowing he had completely won. But he made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He completely forgot who he was dealing with. I stepped directly in front of the advancing paramedics, physically blocking their path to my terrified daughter. The lead police officer dropped his hand quickly to his weapon, ordering me to step aside immediately or face felony arrest for obstructing a lawful court order. I did not move a single inch from my spot. I reached slowly and deliberately into the inner breast pocket of my tailored jacket, keeping my hands completely visible to everyone in the room. The officers tensed, ready to draw their firearms at a moment's notice. I pulled out a solid leather credential case and flipped it open, holding it high enough for every single man in that room to clearly see the shiny gold shield and the official federal seal. "I am Nadine Washington," I announced, my voice booming with absolute unwavering authority. "I am a retired senior compliance auditor for the federal government and currently a sworn active consultant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I pointed a steady accusatory finger directly at the lead officer face. The young woman standing behind me is not a psychiatric patient. She is a highly protected federal witness in an active multi-million-dollar healthcare fraud and human trafficking investigation currently targeting the Sterling Medical Group. The tiny room went completely dead silent. The officers froze, entirely staring at the gold federal badge gleaming brightly under the harsh motel ceiling lights. I took a strong step forward, forcing the large paramedics to quickly back up. "If any of you lay a single finger on my daughter tonight," I continued, my tone deadly and perfectly precise, "you will all be formally charged with tampering with a federal witness, obstructing an active federal investigation, and acting as willing accomplices to medical kidnapping. I highly suggest you lower your weapons and step out of my room right now before I make a phone call that permanently ends all of your law enforcement careers tonight." The lead officer squinted, reading my official credentials carefully, his hands slowly moving away from his holstered weapon. He had been explicitly told he was dealing with a crazy pregnant woman and her confused elderly mother, not a seasoned federal agent with the power to completely ruin his life. Trenton stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red with sudden, uncontrolled rage. "Officer, do not listen to her." Trenton barked, his calm, wealthy facade finally cracking under the intense pressure. "She is retired. She has absolutely no jurisdiction here today. I have a signed legal court order from a state judge. My wife belongs in a hospital bed right now." I turned my gaze slowly toward Trenton, locking eyes with the arrogant monster who had mentally tortured my family. "A corrupt state judge does not outrank the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Trenton," I said, my voice dripping with pure, deadly venom. "I already transmitted the offshore wire transfer receipts between your mother and Chloe Kensington to the Cyber Division in New York. They already have the hidden patient files from your sick little Project Vessel folders." I saw the blood completely drain from Trenton's face in an instant. He stumbled backward slightly, hitting the broken doorframe as the reality of my words washed over him. The local cops looked at Trenton, then looked nervously back at me, realizing they were currently being used as simple pawns in a massive corporate crime ring. The lead officer cleared his throat loudly and took a cautious step backward, signaling his men to stand down immediately. The heavy motel door hung completely broken on its hinges, swinging slightly in the damp night air, long after the corrupt police officers and Trenton finally drove away. We sat together in the suffocating silence of that wrecked room, the flashing neon light outside casting long, jagged shadows across the stained carpet. I had won the battle tonight by using my federal credentials, but Kendra and I both knew we were completely losing the actual war. Trenton had retreated only because he was caught off guard by the threat of federal involvement. But a man with his level of generational wealth and sociopathic entitlement never surrenders. He simply regroups and finds a more ruthless way to destroy his enemies. Kendra sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, her eyes staring blankly at the splintered doorframe. She looked at me and asked what we were supposed to do next, since running away was clearly no longer a viable option. She was absolutely right. The Sterlings practically owned the entire city of Boston. They funded the political campaigns of the local judges, they subsidized the police department pensions, and they controlled the medical boards. If we tried to drive across state lines tonight, Trenton would simply call a corrupt judge, wake him up in the middle of the night, and have a statewide Amber Alert issued for a mentally unstable pregnant woman. We would be pulled over, dragged out of our vehicle, and Kendra would be forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward before the sun even started to rise. I paced the narrow length of the room, my mind calculating every possible legal angle and federal statute. We had the digital records from the clinic server proving the massive financial transactions and the horrific patient data. But digital files can be legally contested in a high-priced courtroom by a team of expensive defense attorneys who specialize in burying evidence. They could easily claim the server was hacked and the files were digitally altered by a disgruntled former employee. To make the federal racketeering charges stick permanently and to absolutely guarantee that Kendra retained full legal custody of the child she was carrying, we needed something completely undeniable. We desperately needed the original physical contracts. We desperately needed the raw documents containing the forged ink signatures. I turned to Kendra and asked her where Trenton kept his most sensitive personal files. She closed her eyes tightly, thinking back to the massive suburban home she had paid for with her own hard-earned money. She told me Trenton had a biometric steel safe hidden behind a bookshelf in his private home office. He never let her see the passcode, and he always locked the heavy mahogany door whenever he was working inside. That safe was the Holy Grail. It was the only place he would hide the original forged surrogacy agreements and the prenuptial addendums. But getting access to that safe meant someone had to go back inside the belly of the beast. It meant walking willingly right back into the pristine, terrifying prison that Trenton had meticulously built, keeping her locked away from the rest of the outside world, completely alone and vulnerable to their relentless manipulations every single day. Kendra looked at me, and she already understood exactly what I was implying without me having to speak another word. She took a deep, shaky breath and wiped the remaining tears from her face. She was no longer just a terrified victim running blindly through the dark. She was a mother fighting for the absolute survival of the child growing inside her, and a mother defending her child is the most dangerous force on the planet. She picked up the cheap burner phone from the small wooden table and held it firmly in her hands. She told me she was going to make the ultimate sacrifice. She was going to play the role of the Trojan horse and infiltrate the Sterling family from the inside. I felt a massive wave of protective fear wash over my entire body. I begged her to reconsider, warning her that if they caught her snooping around Trenton private office, they would not hesitate to lock her in their psychiatric ward immediately. But Kendra shook her head, her beautiful face setting into a mask of pure, cold determination. She knew Trenton's ego was his biggest weakness. He was a wealthy, arrogant narcissist who fully believed that his power was completely absolute. If Kendra crawled back to him completely defeated and entirely submissive, he would eagerly accept her return because it validated his own twisted sense of supreme superiority. She dialed his private cellular number and put the phone on speaker so I could hear every single word. The line rang 3 times before Trenton answered. But when Kendra spoke, her voice was small, trembling, and incredibly fragile. She delivered an absolute masterclass in psychological acting. She apologized profusely for running away from the clinic, claiming her pregnancy hormones had caused a severe panic attack. She begged him to forgive her, saying she felt incredibly lost without him and desperately wanted to come back home to her loving husband. I watched my daughter physically diminish herself, shrinking her shoulders and keeping her head bowed as she fed the monster on the other end of the line exactly what he wanted to hear. Trenton processed her sudden submission in agonizing silence. When he finally spoke again, the cold edge in his voice was entirely gone, completely replaced by that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone he used to manipulate her. He let out a soft, gentle sigh, telling her that he was incredibly relieved she had finally come to her senses. He praised her bravery in admitting her mental frailties, promising absolute perfect care going forward. He told her to pack her bags immediately and said he would personally send his private driver to pick her up from whatever disgusting motel she was hiding in. Kendra thanked him through fake tears, hanging up the phone. The second the screen went completely dark, her fragile demeanor vanished entirely. Her posture straightened and her eyes hardened into absolute fury. She was going back into the darkest depths of the Sterling Empire, but this time she was not going as a loving wife. She was going as a highly motivated spy, ready to completely dismantle their entire life from the inside out. We spent 3 hours planning her infiltration strategy perfectly. I taught her to recognize digital keystroke patterns, to memorize his safe passcode by watching his fingers. I showed her how to use a microcamera hidden discreetly inside her lipstick tube. I warned her to never eat or drink anything prepared exclusively for her, unless she saw Trenton consume the exact same food first. I fully expected them to begin slipping heavy psychiatric sedatives into her daily meals to keep her compliant. Kendra absorbed every single piece of federal espionage training with intense, perfect focus. We walked outside just as a massive black luxury vehicle pulled smoothly up to the curb, revealing Trenton private security driver glaring coldly at us. We shared no emotional goodbye because the driver was watching. Kendra climbed quickly into the back seat without looking back, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing completely into the dense morning fog. The massive iron gates of the Sterling family estate slowly swung open, revealing the sprawling, incredibly manicured grounds of their private, heavily guarded compound. The vehicle glided smoothly up the long, winding driveway, coming to a silent stop right in front of the massive grand entrance. The heavy wooden double doors were already wide open, waiting for her arrival. Standing perfectly rigid on the front marble steps was Constance Sterling. She was wearing a flawless beige designer pantsuit, not a single blonde hair out of place, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Kendra stepped slowly out of the dark vehicle, keeping her head respectfully lowered, maintaining the fragile, broken persona we had carefully practiced in the motel room. She walked slowly up the wide stone stairs, entirely anticipating the fake warm embrace Constance usually reserved for public appearances, or perhaps a condescending remark about her recent dramatic disappearance. But Constance did not open her arms to welcome her daughter-in-law back home. She did not even offer a fake, polite smile or pretend to care about her emotional well-being. As Kendra finally reached the top step of the grand entrance, Constance simply reached out her cold, pale hand and pressed a heavily laminated piece of thick paper firmly against my daughter's chest. Kendra looked down at the paper, entirely confused. It was a highly detailed, incredibly strict daily dietary and medication schedule, broken down into exact 15-minute intervals. Constance stared dead into Kendra's eyes with absolutely zero emotion, her voice dripping with an icy, terrifyingly polite, completely sociopathic finality. "Let us keep the vessel healthy, shall we?" The massive Sterling estate was a fortress disguised as a luxury mansion. From the moment Kendra walked through those heavy oak doors, she became a high-value prisoner in a gilded cage. Every single room in the house was equipped with state-of-the-art security cameras. Trenton claimed they were installed to ensure her safety in case she had another prenatal panic attack. But Kendra knew the truth. They were watching her every single move, monitoring her daily habits, and making sure she never tried to escape again. Her personal cell phone was completely confiscated the first night. Trenton handed her a new pre-programmed device that only allowed calls to him, Constance, and the clinic. The internet browser was entirely disabled. She was completely cut off from the outside world, entirely dependent on the people who were actively trying to destroy her. Constance became her permanent warden. She moved into the guest wing of the mansion under the guise of helping her son care for his fragile wife. Constance orchestrated every single aspect of Kendra's daily life with terrifying precision. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Constance would unlock the master bedroom door, holding a silver tray loaded with unseasoned organic food and a handful of brightly colored prenatal vitamins. Constance never spoke directly to Kendra as a human being. She spoke to her abdomen. She would place her cold, pale hand on Kendra's stomach and murmur about the superior genetics of the Sterling family line. The daily microaggressions were relentless and entirely deliberate. Constance constantly made subtle, degrading comments about Kendra's physical appearance, her background, and her intelligence. She would casually mention how grateful the family was that Chloe Kensington had provided such pristine genetic material. She told Kendra she needed to eat more leafy greens to ensure the vessel remained hospitable for their precious heir. Kendra forced herself to swallow the bland food and the insults every single day. She swallowed the vitamins only after secretly swapping them with the safe supplements I had smuggled to her in a hollowed-out lotion bottle. She played the role of the docile, defeated woman perfectly. She kept her head down and her voice quiet, apologizing constantly for her previous emotional outbursts. She let Constance believe she had completely broken her spirit. But beneath that fragile, submissive exterior, my daughter was a highly trained federal operative operating deep behind enemy lines. She spent her endless empty hours carefully mapping out the entire estate in her mind, locating every single camera blind spot, and memorizing the exact shift changes of the private security guards patrolling the manicured grounds outside. She endured the psychological torture because she knew the ultimate victory required absolute patience. Every time Constance insulted her, Kendra simply closed her eyes and pictured the heavy steel safe hidden inside Trenton private home office. She knew the original forged contracts were locked inside that vault. She just needed the perfect opportunity to strike. When Trenton came home from the clinic every evening, he played the role of the loving, supportive husband. He would kiss her forehead and ask how she was feeling, entirely ignoring the fact that he was keeping her hostage. He would sit at the massive mahogany dining table, eating lavish meals prepared by their private chef, while Kendra was forced to eat steamed vegetables and boiled chicken. He would talk endlessly about his ambitious plans for the future of his medical group, while Kendra sat silently nodding and agreeing with every single word he said. She watched him drink expensive scotch and laugh with his mother, sharing inside jokes about their wealthy country club friends. The sheer sociopathy required to sit across from the woman you drugged and violated and pretend everything was perfectly normal was staggering. Kendra felt a deep, violent sickness in her stomach every time he looked at her. But she never let the mask slip. She forced herself to smile softly and thank him for taking such good care of her. She allowed him to believe he was the smartest, most powerful man in the world. This was the hardest part of the mission. She had to completely surrender her pride and her dignity to survive. She had to let them think they had entirely won. While they thought she was sleeping or resting, Kendra was actually running a systematic surveillance operation on her own husband. She knew Trenton was a creature of absolute habit. Wealthy, arrogant men always believe their routines are entirely flawless. She tracked his every movement. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he worked late at the flagship clinic. Every Wednesday evening, he locked himself inside his private home office to review the family trust financial portfolios. The home office was strictly off-limits. The heavy door was always locked, and the biometric keypad required both a fingerprint and a 6-digit numeric code. Kendra knew she could not bypass the fingerprint scanner, but she had noticed Trenton occasionally suffered from severe eczema on his hands during the humid summer months. When his skin flared up, the scanner failed, forcing him to rely entirely on the manual numeric override code. She just needed to be in the right place at exactly the right time to catch him using it. She began quietly altering her own evening routine. She started bringing him a glass of warm lemon water right before he entered his office, claiming she wanted to make sure he stayed hydrated while working late. She would walk down the long, carpeted hallway, her footsteps completely silent, balancing the crystal glass carefully. She would arrive just as he was standing in front of the heavy wooden door. She did this 4 nights in a row, conditioning him to expect her brief, submissive presence. On the 5th night, his eczema was particularly aggressive. His knuckles were red and inflamed. Kendra approached, holding the glass of water, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. Trenton pressed his thumb against the glowing green scanner, but it beeped angrily, flashing a bright red error message. He let out a frustrated sigh and quickly typed his numeric override code into the keypad. He thought Kendra was not paying attention, but she was watching his hand movement intensely through the perfect reflection of the large antique mirror hanging on the opposite wall. The mirror angle gave her a clear, unobstructed view of the keypad. She watched his long, manicured fingers quickly punch the numbers in rapid succession. 490288. The heavy lock clicked open with a satisfying mechanical clunk. He took the water glass from her hand, kissed her cheek dismissively, and walked into his office, shutting the heavy door firmly behind him. Kendra stood in the empty hallway, her heart hammering wildly against her chest. She repeated the 6 numbers over and over again in her mind, permanently searing them into her memory. 490288. She had the key to the castle. Now she just needed him to leave the house unguarded. That perfect opportunity arrived 2 days later when Constance traveled to New York for a weekend socialite gala, and Trenton received an emergency page from his clinic late Friday night. He threw on his suit jacket, told Kendra to stay in bed, and rushed out the front door. The massive estate was completely silent, except for the distant hum of the central air conditioning. Kendra waited exactly 2 hours to ensure he was not coming back for a forgotten item. At exactly 2:00 in the morning, she slipped out of her bed. She moved silently through the dark, empty hallways, avoiding the cameras she had memorized. She reached the heavy wooden door of his private office. She took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands, and punched the 6 digits into the keypad. 490288. The lock clicked open. She pushed the door open and stepped into the pitch-black room, using only a tiny pen light to guide her way. She moved quickly behind his massive mahogany desk, locating the steel wall safe hidden behind a framed painting. She entered the exact same 6-digit code. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, she found exactly what we needed. She pulled out the thick manila folders, finding the original surrogacy contracts with her forged signature clearly visible at the bottom of the page. She used her micro camera to photograph every single document, capturing the undeniable proof of his massive fraud. But as she reached into the very back of the deep safe, her hand brushed against a thin, stark white envelope bearing the official seal of the State Department of Health. She pulled it out and opened the flap. It was an official death certificate, entirely filled out and legally notarized. She shined her tiny light over the heavy black text. The name on the document was Kendra Sterling. The listed cause of death was severe hemorrhage and complications during childbirth. The date of death was left completely blank. The air completely vanished from the room. She stared at her own death certificate, her blood turning to absolute ice. They were never planning to commit her to a psychiatric ward. The mental health narrative was just a temporary cover story to keep her compliant until the baby was born. Trenton and Constance had already legally finalized her murder. They were planning to kill her the second she delivered their precious heir. The air in Trenton private office felt so thick, Kendra could barely breathe. She stared at the blank death certificate bearing her own name, her mind racing with absolute terror. She carefully placed the document back into the steel safe and closed the heavy door, listening to the mechanical lock slide back into place. She crept back to her bedroom, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had the photographic evidence secured on the tiny memory card hidden inside her lipstick tube, but she was completely trapped inside a heavily guarded fortress. She could not walk out the front door, and she certainly could not use the monitored phone to call me. She needed a physical courier. Over the next 2 days, Kendra observed the estate staff with intense focus. The private security guards were entirely loyal to Trenton, and the senior butler reported directly to Constance. But there was a young housekeeper named Elena who worked the weekend shifts. Elena was a quiet college student who always kept her head down. More importantly, Kendra noticed Elena looking at her with genuine sympathy whenever Constance delivered her cruel daily insults. Kendra knew Elena was her only chance. On Sunday afternoon, while Constance was hosting a charity luncheon, Kendra intentionally spilled a glass of water on her carpet. She rang the service bell and waited. A few minutes later, Elena knocked softly and entered carrying fresh towels. Kendra moved quickly to the door and locked it quietly. Elena looked up startled, but Kendra raised a finger to her lips, pleading for absolute silence. Kendra pulled a heavy diamond tennis bracelet from her jewelry box. It was a gift Trenton had bought her worth easily $30,000. Kendra pressed the sparkling diamonds into Elena's hand, along with a sealed envelope containing the micro-memory card and a note with my burner phone number. Kendra looked the terrified young woman directly in the eyes, tears streaming down her face. She begged Elena to take the envelope far away from the estate and mail it from a public post office in another city. She told Elena the diamond bracelet was hers to keep to pay for her college tuition. She just needed this one desperate favor to save her unborn child. Elena looked at the heavy diamond bracelet and then up at my desperate pregnant daughter. The young housekeeper swallowed hard, nodding slowly. She slipped the envelope and the jewelry deep into her uniform apron. Elena unlocked the bedroom door and walked out without saying a single word. For 3 agonizing days, Kendra waited in complete silence, terrified that Elena had turned the envelope over to Constance for a cash reward. But Elena was a good person. On Wednesday morning, I walked out of my cheap motel room and found a small padded envelope sitting quietly inside the roadside mailbox. I tore it open and found the memory card. I plugged it into my encrypted laptop and downloaded the images. When I saw the forged surrogacy contracts, my heart soared with victory. But when I clicked on the final image and saw the pre-written death certificate, my blood turned to absolute ice. They were not just stealing her baby, they were actively planning a murder. I knew immediately that photographic evidence alone would not be enough to secure a federal indictment before Kendra went into labor. Wealthy corporate defense lawyers could easily argue the photos were digitally altered by a bitter mother-in-law. I needed a highly credible medical professional to testify under oath that the physical surrogacy implantation had occurred and that the Sterling family had orchestrated the entire fraud. I needed Dr. Naomi Hayes. I used my federal contacts to track her address. I left a secure anonymous message on her answering machine telling her to meet me at a deserted diner on the outskirts of the city at midnight. I arrived an hour early, sitting in a dark corner booth, nursing a cold cup of coffee while watching the empty parking lot. Exactly at midnight, Naomi walked through the diner doors. She looked absolutely exhausted, her eyes sunken and her shoulders completely slumped. She slid into the booth across from me, refusing to even look at the waitress who offered her a menu. Before I could even speak, Naomi shook her head, her voice trembling with intense fear and deep regret. She told me I should never have contacted her. She said the Sterling family had completely destroyed her life since the day we escaped the clinic. Trenton had fired her immediately, revoking her hospital privileges and blacklisting her name across the entire East Coast Medical Board. But they did not stop there. Constance had hired private investigators to follow Naomi teenage children to their high school. They sent her anonymous letters threatening to completely ruin her husband's career and ensure her family ended up completely destitute if she ever spoke a single word about Kendra medical files. Naomi looked at me with tears welling in her exhausted eyes, asking how she could possibly help me when her own family was constantly being hunted by billionaires. I reached across the sticky diner table and gently took her shaking hands in mine. I did not offer her empty platitudes or fake sympathy. I spoke to her with the absolute cold authority of a senior federal investigator. I told her that running and hiding would never stop a family like the Sterlings. They would always view her as a loose end, and they would never truly let her live in peace. I pulled a printed copy of the death certificate from my jacket pocket and slid it across the table. I watched Naomi's eyes widen in absolute horror as she read the blank official document. I told her they were planning to murder my daughter on an operating table the second that baby was born. I told Naomi she was the only person standing between my child and a shallow grave. I promised her the full, unlimited protection of the federal government. I told her I was currently building a massive racketeering case with the Cyber Division, and if she agreed to become our star medical witness, I would personally ensure her entire family was placed into the Federal Witness Protection Program before the indictments were unsealed. I promised her new identities, a secure location, and complete financial stability paid for by the Department of Justice. I looked deep into her frightened eyes, appealing to the oath she took as a doctor to do no harm. I asked her to stand up and fight back against the wealthy monsters who thought they could buy and sell the bodies of black women for their own sick legacy. Naomi stared at the death certificate for a long, heavy moment, the ambient noise of the diner completely fading away. She took a deep, ragged breath and wiped the tears from her cheeks. The paralyzing fear in her eyes slowly shifted, morphing into a deep, righteous anger. She looked up at me and nodded her head. She agreed to testify. A massive wave of profound relief washed over me. We finally had the undeniable legal testimony we desperately needed to bring the federal hammer down on Trenton and his sociopathic family. Naomi and I spent the next hour quietly discussing the logistics of her protective custody transfer. We agreed she would pack a bag and meet my federal contact at a secure private airfield 2 days from now. We stood up feeling absolute determination. Naomi walked out the front doors, heading quickly toward her sedan parked under a street lamp. I stayed behind, paying the bill and making sure she drove away safely. We both thought we had been incredibly careful. We both thought the middle of the night in a forgotten part of town was entirely safe. But we had vastly underestimated the financial resources of the Sterling Empire. Across the dark, empty street, parked silently in the deep shadows, sat an unmarked black utility vehicle. Inside the dark cabin, a private investigator employed directly by Constance Sterling slowly lowered a high-powered digital camera. He had followed Naomi, tracking her every movement. He looked at the glowing digital screen, zooming in perfectly on the clear images of Naomi and me sitting together in the diner booth, passing the printed documents back and forth. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a private number. Trenton answered his voice cold and alert. The investigator calmly reported that the disgraced doctor had just made direct contact with the retired federal auditor. He confirmed we were actively building a case against them. Sitting in his lavish home office surrounded by the stolen wealth of his victims, Trenton stared blankly at the wall. He realized the doctor had officially flipped. He hung up the phone slowly, his mind calculating a new, much more violent strategy. The trap was closing in on us, and the clock had just violently run out. The morning after my midnight meeting with Dr. Hayes, I woke up to an absolute nightmare. I walked into the local branch of my bank just after 9 to withdraw some cash for food and gas. The teller swiped my card and her face instantly dropped. She told me my accounts were completely locked. I demanded to speak to the manager immediately. The manager pulled me into his small glass office looking incredibly nervous. He explained that a massive federal injunction had been filed overnight, completely freezing my government pension and all my personal savings. He said the paperwork alleged I was under active investigation for severe corporate espionage and massive financial fraud. Trenton had used his high-powered legal team to completely fabricate a federal complaint against me. They bribed the right corrupt officials and twisted the broken legal system to cut off my only source of survival. I walked out of that bank with exactly $42 in my pocket. But the Sterlings were not just trying to starve me out. They wanted to send a violent physical message to ensure I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I drove my sedan across town, heading back to my own quiet suburban neighborhood to gather some hidden emergency cash I kept secretly under my floorboards. But I never even made it down my street. 3 blocks away, the sky was thick with heavy black smoke billowing violently into the crisp morning air. I pulled my car over and got out, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. Massive red fire trucks and local police cruisers were completely blocking the main intersection. I pushed my way through the growing crowd of terrified neighbors until I saw it. My beautiful two-story home, the house where I raised my brilliant daughter, was completely engulfed in massive roaring flames. The intense heat hit my face like a violent physical blow. The heavy roof caved in with a deafening crash, sending a massive shower of bright orange sparks high into the dark sky. A local fire chief walked past me, shouting urgent orders into his heavy radio. I grabbed his heavy yellow jacket and asked him what happened. He looked at me with grim, exhausted eyes and told me his crew found multiple empty gasoline canisters near the back porch. He said it was a highly professional, coordinated arson job meant to destroy all evidence. Trenton and Constance had sent their private thugs to burn my entire life to the absolute ground. They wanted to show me that my 30 years of federal service meant absolutely nothing against their billions of dollars. They thought seeing my home reduced to a pile of black ashes would completely break my spirit and force me to surrender. They thought I would drop to my knees and beg them for mercy. They thought burning my house would make me run away and abandon my pregnant daughter to their twisted medical experiments. But as I stood there watching the brutal flames consume everything I owned, I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or fall apart in front of the crowd. A cold, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. Trenton had just made the biggest miscalculation of his arrogant sociopathic life. He destroyed my house, but he also destroyed the only thing tying me to a predictable location. He completely freed me to become a dangerous, invisible ghost. I walked quickly away from the burning wreckage of my home and walked exactly 3 miles to a dirty public payphone outside a rundown gas station. I dialed my contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Division. Marcus picked up the phone, and I told him my house was gone and my pension was completely frozen. Marcus swore loudly, telling me the Sterlings were officially moving to eliminate all their loose ends. He told me to ditch my car because Trenton Private Security would definitely track the license plates. Marcus sent a covert extraction team to pick me up at a deserted shopping mall an hour later. 2 large federal agents in plain dark clothes put me in the back of an unmarked van and drove me to a highly classified secure safe house hidden deep in the industrial sector of the city. The safe house was a massive concrete bunker filled with humming servers, heavy weapons, and encrypted communication arrays. Marcus was waiting for me at the heavy steel door. He handed me a fresh cup of coffee and a brand new encrypted laptop. We did not have time to mourn my lost property. We had a massive corporate crime syndicate to completely dismantle. I sat down at the metal desk and opened the files Kendra had smuggled out of the Sterling mansion. We had the forged surrogacy contracts, the digital server logs proving they manipulated dozens of vulnerable minority women, and the chilling death certificate bearing my daughter's name. Marcus and I spent the next 72 hours working without any sleep, entirely fueled by black coffee and righteous federal vengeance. We were meticulously compiling a massive racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organizations file against the entire Sterling family empire. A federal racketeering charge was the absolute nuclear option. It allowed the government to seize every single asset the Sterlings owned and throw the entire family into federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. We mapped out their offshore bank accounts, connecting the massive payments made to wealthy white egg donors directly to the fraudulent charity surgeries performed on unsuspecting women of color. We built an ironclad criminal timeline proving Trenton and Constance operated a highly lucrative human trafficking ring right under the guise of an elite private fertility clinic. We had Dr. Naomi Hayes safely tucked away in federal protective custody, ready to testify before a grand jury. The trap was perfectly set, and we were just waiting for a federal judge to sign the massive stack of arrest warrants. But while we were carefully building our perfect legal trap inside the secure safe house, the horrific situation inside the Sterling mansion was rapidly turning into an absolute waking nightmare. Kendra was now exactly 8 months pregnant, her belly heavy with the child she was fighting desperately to protect. She was still perfectly playing the exhausting role of the broken, submissive wife, entirely cut off from my daily communication. She did not know my beloved house had completely burned down. She did not know I was hiding in a federal bunker. She just knew she had to survive a few more weeks until her natural due date. But Constance Sterling had absolutely no intention of waiting for nature to take its course. Constance knew the relentless federal government was rapidly closing in on their massive medical fraud operation. Trenton had told his mother that I was still missing and dangerous. They needed to extract the baby immediately and eliminate Kendra before the authorities could ever intervene. Over the past 3 days, Constance had drastically changed Kendra's daily routine. Instead of bringing her the usual morning breakfast, Constance started forcing Kendra to drink a bitter dark herbal tea every single afternoon. Constance claimed it was an ancient, powerful, holistic remedy explicitly meant to strengthen the uterine lining for a smooth delivery. Kendra tried to refuse the bitter drink, but Constance stood over her shoulder watching with cold, dead eyes until she swallowed every single drop. Kendra did not know the tea was heavily laced with a powerful chemical labor-inducing drug carefully procured from their private hospital pharmacy. On the 4th afternoon, right as the heavy grandfather clock chimed 3 times, Kendra felt the first violent cramp rip through her lower abdomen. The pain was sudden, sharp, and incredibly intense, completely stealing the remaining breath from her tired lungs. She dropped the teacup, shattering the delicate porcelain across the hardwood floor. She gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany dining table, her knuckles turning pure white, as a second massive contraction hit her body with brutal, terrifying force. This was absolutely not a false alarm. Her body was being artificially forced into premature labor. Constance stepped gracefully over the shattered teacup, a cold, sinister smile slowly spreading across her perfectly painted face. She did not call for an ambulance. She did not panic or rush to help her desperate, suffering daughter-in-law. Instead, she pulled a sleek black radio from her pocket and calmly instructed Trenton Private Security Team to prepare the underground medical transport van. Kendra collapsed onto her knees, screaming loudly in absolute agonizing pain as yet another violent contraction tore through her heavy stomach. She looked up at Constance, her vision blurring with hot, terrified tears. Constance simply crouched down, adjusting the collar of her expensive designer blouse. "Let us go deliver my beautiful grandchild," Constance whispered, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated evil. "And then we can finally put you to sleep forever. Your usefulness is over." Kendra lay on the expensive hardwood floor of the massive dining room, entirely paralyzed by the sheer physical agony tearing through her lower body. The bitter herbal tea Constance had forced her to drink was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was violently forcing her body into premature labor right at the 8-month mark. Another massive contraction hit her stomach, making her vision blur with dark spots. She tried to crawl toward the doorway, but her arms completely gave out beneath her heavy weight. Constance stood a few feet away, watching her struggle with an expression of absolute bored indifference. Footsteps echoed heavily down the grand hallway, and Trenton rushed into the room. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, holding his expensive leather briefcase. He stopped and looked down at his pregnant wife writhing in agony on the floor. For a split second, Kendra thought she saw a flicker of genuine human panic in his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. "Please call 911, she gasped, her voice completely hoarse from screaming. "Please, Trenton, the baby is coming too early. We need an ambulance right now." Trenton slowly set his leather briefcase down on the polished mahogany dining table. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his cell phone. But he did not dial the emergency dispatcher. He dialed a private secure number connecting directly to the Sterling Medical Group underground cleanup team. He spoke in a low, calm voice, ordering a sterile transport van to the main estate immediately. He told the voice on the other end to prep the off-the-grid surgical center for an emergency extraction. Kendra stared up at him, her heart shattering into a million tiny pieces. "You cannot do this," she cried, struggling to push herself up off the floor. "I need a real hospital." Trenton simply crouched down beside her, smoothing a stray lock of hair away from her sweaty forehead. "Shh, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice sickeningly sweet. "I am taking you to a private facility. You are going to get the absolute best medical care in the world." 10 minutes later, a large black, unmarked utility van pulled aggressively up to the front doors of the estate. 4 large men wearing sterile black scrubs rushed into the house carrying a heavy medical gurney. They did not wear normal paramedic badges. They moved with silent military precision. They lifted Kendra onto the cold stretcher, strapping heavy leather restraints across her chest and her legs. She fought them wildly, screaming for someone to help her, but the massive estate was completely empty except for her captors. They wheeled her out the front doors and shoved the gurney into the back of the dark van. Trenton climbed into the back, sitting on a metal bench directly beside her. The heavy doors slammed shut, plunging them into near-total darkness. The van sped away from the estate without a single siren blaring, completely invisible to the outside world. The contractions were hitting her every 2 minutes now, leaving her completely breathless and delirious with pain. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was never coming back from wherever they were taking her. The death certificate she had found in the safe was about to be signed and filed. She felt the cold metal of the gurney pressing against her spine. The air inside the van smelled strongly of bleach and chemical antiseptics. Trenton stared down at her with cold, dead eyes, entirely detached from the horrific suffering he was inflicting on his own wife. He was already thinking about his perfect life with Chloe and his genetically pure child. Kendra knew she was completely out of time. If she arrived at that secret surgical center, she would never see the light of day again. Despite the overwhelming pain completely consuming her body, Kendra forced her mind to focus on survival. She remembered the desperate conversation we had in the cheap roadside motel right before she agreed to return to the mansion. I knew she would be walking into a highly monitored environment where her phone and internet access would be completely confiscated. So I had provided her with one final absolute lifeline. Before she left, I had taken her favorite pair of black flat shoes and carefully removed the inner sole of the right shoe. I had embedded a tiny military-grade global positioning system tracker directly into the rubber heel. The tiny device was wired with a silent federal distress signal. It was designed for undercover agents operating in deep-cover hostile environments. I told her that if she ever felt her life was in immediate terminal danger, she needed to press the hidden button exactly 3 times in rapid succession. The signal would bypass all local cell towers and transmit directly to the secure servers at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division, but her feet were strapped tightly to the bottom of the heavy medical gurney. The thick leather restraints dug painfully into her ankles, preventing her from moving her legs. Trenton was sitting less than 2 feet away, watching her every single movement with absolute predatory focus. She needed to create a massive physical distraction. She needed him to look away just long enough for her to reach the heel of her right shoe. A massive contraction began to build in her lower abdomen, sending a shockwave of blinding pain through her nervous system. Instead of fighting the pain, Kendra leaned entirely into it. She let out a blood-curdling, terrifying scream, throwing her head back against the metal stretcher. She began to physically thrash and convulse wildly, shaking the entire gurney. She arched her back violently, pretending she was going into severe medical shock. Trenton jumped up from the metal bench, his perfect calm finally cracking. He leaned over her, trying to hold her shoulders down, shouting at her to stop moving. In the chaos of her violent thrashing, Kendra managed to twist her right ankle just enough to slip it partially out of the heavy leather restraint. She curled her body inward, bringing her hand down toward her foot, while Trenton was entirely focused on holding her upper body down. Her trembling fingers brushed against the soft leather of her right shoe. She felt the tiny, hard lump hidden beneath the fabric. She pressed her thumb down hard against the hidden button. 1, 2, 3. She prayed with every single ounce of her remaining strength that I was still alive and looking at my federal monitors. She prayed the tiny blinking light on the federal server was actively transmitting her exact coordinates. Trenton finally managed to pin her arms down, breathing heavily as he stared at her sweating face. He told her she was acting completely hysterical. Kendra let her body go completely limp, panting heavily, tears streaming down her face. She closed her eyes, pretending to surrender to the pain, but deep inside her mind, a tiny spark of absolute defiant hope began to burn brightly. She had just dropped a digital beacon right on top of his secret operation. The federal government was coming. The unmarked utility van suddenly lurched to a violent stop, throwing Kendra slightly forward against the heavy leather restraints. The rear doors swung open, revealing a stark, terrifying underground concrete parking garage. The air was incredibly damp and cold, completely void of any natural sunlight. The large men in sterile black scrubs grabbed the metal gurney and pulled her roughly out of the dark vehicle. They wheeled her rapidly down a long, narrow concrete hallway, illuminated only by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. There were no windows, no exit signs, and absolutely no other patients. This was not a hospital. It was a highly classified secret surgical bunker built explicitly for illegal procedures and making human beings disappear completely without a single trace. The wheels of the gurney rattled loudly against the smooth concrete floor, echoing ominously through the desolate, empty corridors. They pushed her through a set of heavy automated metal doors directly into a massive, sterile operating room. The room was freezing cold, filled with terrifyingly advanced surgical equipment and heavy steel medical trays. A massive array of blinding bright surgical lights hung directly above the operating table, casting a harsh white glare across the entire room. Two private nurses wearing full surgical masks and heavy face shields stood silently by the metal tables, organizing rows of sharp surgical instruments. They did not speak a single word or offer any comforting medical reassurance. They simply treated Kendra like a biological specimen, completely ready for processing. The men transferred her roughly from the transport gurney onto the freezing cold steel operating table, tightening a new set of heavy medical straps across her wrists and ankles. She was completely immobilized, entirely trapped under the blinding white lights. Trenton walked slowly into the operating room, completely transformed. He was no longer wearing his expensive tailored navy suit. He was dressed entirely in sterile blue surgical scrubs, a blue medical cap covering his dark hair. He walked over to a metal tray and slowly pulled a pair of tight latex gloves onto his hands, the sharp snapping sound of the rubber echoing loudly in the silent, terrifying room. He picked up a large plastic syringe filled with a thick, cloudy liquid. He tapped the side of the plastic tube, slowly pushing a tiny drop of the liquid out of the sharp metal needle. He walked over to the side of the operating table, looking down at the terrified woman he had promised to love and protect forever. He leaned down incredibly close to her face, his cold blue eyes entirely devoid of any human soul. He held the sharp needle directly over the intravenous line, completely taped to her trembling arm. "Shh, go to sleep. When you wake up, it will all be over, and my son will be with his real mother." The harsh, blinding white lights of the underground operating room beat down on my daughter like a physical weight. Kendra lay completely immobilized on the freezing steel surgical table, her wrists and ankles bound tightly by thick leather straps. The heavy air in the room was entirely saturated with the suffocating chemical smell of bleach and medical antiseptics. Trenton stood directly over her, dressed in sterile blue scrubs, looking down at her with a completely hollow, sociopathic expression. He held a large plastic syringe filled with a thick, cloudy sedative. The sharp metal needle caught the bright overhead lights, gleaming with a terrifying, deadly promise. He reached down with his left hand, gripping her bare arm tightly, entirely, ignoring her frantic, desperate pleas. Kendra tried to pull her arm away, but the heavy leather restraints held her completely captive. She looked into the cold blue eyes of the man she had once deeply loved, and saw absolutely nothing but pure, calculated evil. He was entirely ready to put her to sleep, deliver the baby, and then ensure she never woke up again to tell her story. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs, matching the frantic, terrifying rhythm of the artificial contractions ripping through her body. Trenton leaned closer, his breath ghosting across her sweaty face. He told her to simply relax and let the medicine do its work. He promised her it would all be completely over very soon, and his perfect son would finally be safe with his real mother. Kendra closed her eyes tightly, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, preparing for the absolute dark end. She felt the cold tip of the needle press firmly against her sensitive skin, right above the blue vein in her arm. But before he could push the deadly needle into her flesh, the heavy automated steel doors of the underground operating room completely bowed inward with a massive, deafening metallic crunch. The solid steel frame buckled violently under the sheer immense pressure of a tactical explosive breaching charge. A fraction of a second later, the doors were completely blown off their heavy hinges. The massive steel slabs flew through the air, crashing violently into the expensive medical equipment, shattering glass and destroying the sterile environment instantly. A thick cloud of gray concrete dust and smoke immediately flooded into the bright room, completely blinding the private nurses and plunging the surgical team into absolute chaos. Trenton stumbled backward, dropping the heavy plastic syringe onto the cold concrete floor. He threw his hands over his face, coughing violently as the heavy tactical smoke grenades rolled across the ground, filling the room with a suffocating fog. The deafening blare of federal emergency sirens echoed through the destroyed doorway, completely drowning out the loud alarms of the surgical center. Heavy combat boots pounded against the concrete floor as multiple heavily armed tactical operatives poured into the room through the thick gray smoke. Kendra opened her tear-filled eyes, struggling to see through the chaotic haze. She saw the bright red lasers of tactical rifles cutting through the thick smoke, locking directly onto the chests of the terrified surgical staff. The underground bunker had been completely breached, and the terrifying reign of the Sterling family was finally coming to a violent, spectacular end. Through the swirling gray dust and the blinding tactical strobe lights, I walked slowly into the destroyed operating room. I was entirely flanked by a massive squad of heavily armored Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and a senior federal prosecutor. I wore my heavy, dark federal jacket, my gold badge gleaming brightly against my chest. I looked across the chaotic room and saw my beautiful, pregnant daughter strapped to that cold metal table, entirely vulnerable and completely terrified. A wave of pure, absolute maternal rage washed over my entire body, pushing away any remaining fear I had left. I pointed a steady, commanding finger directly at the two private surgical nurses who were currently cowering behind a heavy steel instrument tray. Federal agents immediately swarmed them, forcing them violently onto the cold concrete floor and securing their hands tightly behind their backs with heavy plastic zip ties. The senior federal prosecutor, a tall, imposing black woman named Sarah, stepped forward, reading the massive list of federal racketeering charges loudly over the sheer chaos of the room. She announced that the entire Sterling Medical Group was officially being seized by the United States government under the RICO Act. Trenton stood completely frozen near the shattered medical equipment, his blue surgical cap knocked entirely askew, his pristine scrubs covered in gray concrete dust. His incredibly arrogant sociopathic mind simply could not process the absolute reality of what was happening to him. He was a wealthy, untouchable billionaire, and the federal government had just violently kicked his massive door completely down. I walked directly up to him, completely ignoring the heavily armed tactical agents securing the perimeter around us. Trenton looked at me, his cold blue eyes finally filling with genuine, absolute terror. "You have absolutely no legal right to be in here," he screamed, his voice completely cracking with panic. "This is a private medical facility, and I am conducting an emergency surgical procedure on my legal wife." I did not even blink at his pathetic, desperate lies. I stepped so close to him I could smell the sharp metallic scent of his nervous sweat mixed with the heavy concrete dust. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and told him his entire criminal empire was completely over. I told him we had already raided his private home office and secured the forged surrogacy contracts from his hidden biometric safe. I watched the blood completely drain from his pale, aristocratic face as I mentioned the pre-written death certificate. I told him Chloe Kensington had already been formally arrested at her luxury country club an hour ago, and she was currently singing like a bird to federal agents, hoping to completely avoid a life sentence. Trenton staggered backward, completely losing his balance, his legs entirely giving out beneath him. He hit the cold concrete floor hard, staring up at me with an expression of absolute shattered defeat. The federal prosecutor stepped forward, holding a thick stack of official warrants. She looked down at him with absolute disgust and formally declared him under federal arrest for massive healthcare fraud, illegal human trafficking, and attempted murder. Two massive federal tactical agents grabbed Trenton roughly by his shoulders, dragging him violently to his feet. They slammed him forcefully against the cold concrete wall, patting him down for weapons before pulling his arms tightly behind his back. The loud, harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists was the most beautiful, incredible sound I had ever heard in my entire 30-year federal career. He was finally completely powerless, stripped of his wealth and his arrogant titles, entirely reduced to a pathetic criminal facing decades in a dark federal prison cell. Trenton began to thrash violently against the heavy grip of the tactical agents, screaming frantically for his private security team to come down to the bunker and physically remove us. He yelled that his family paid their salaries and they needed to protect him from this illegal raid. But his desperate screaming echoed completely unanswered through the destroyed corridors. The senior federal prosecutor looked at him with a cold, triumphant smile. She calmly informed him that his entire highly paid private security force had already been completely disarmed and formally arrested in the upper parking garage. Trenton finally realized he was entirely alone, abandoned by his vast wealth and heading straight to federal prison. The agents forcefully dragged him out of the operating room, his pathetic, desperate screams slowly fading down the long, dark concrete hallway. I immediately rushed to the side of the freezing cold surgical table, my hands shaking wildly as I worked to undo the thick, heavy leather straps binding my daughter. Kendra sobbed uncontrollably, reaching her arms up and wrapping them tightly around my neck the second her wrists were finally free. I held her incredibly close, burying my face in her damp hair, telling her she was completely safe and the monsters were entirely gone. The terrible nightmare was finally completely over, and we had absolutely won the massive war against the Sterling family. But as I reached down to unbuckle the final heavy strap across her swollen ankles, Kendra suddenly gasped loudly, her entire body completely tensing in my arms. I looked down and saw a massive rush of clear, warm fluid soaking through her hospital gown, pooling onto the cold steel operating table. Her water had just completely broken for real. She was going into active natural labor weeks before her actual due date in a destroyed underground bunker filled with concrete dust and shattered glass. "We cannot stay here," I shouted. "The baby is coming right now, and we need a real hospital immediately." The thick gray concrete dust from the underground bunker clung to our clothes as the federal medical transport team rushed Kendra into the back of a heavily armored ambulance. The tactical agents secured the perimeter while a federal paramedic immediately began working on my daughter. Her water had completely broken, and her body was racked with violent artificial contractions that the Sterling family had deliberately triggered. I held her trembling hand tightly as the ambulance tore through the dark city streets, its heavy sirens screaming a warning to anyone in our path. We were not going to one of the pristine private medical facilities controlled by the Sterling Empire. We were heading straight to the massive public county hospital in downtown Boston, which was currently under strict federal jurisdiction for this exact operation. The brilliant neon lights of the city blurred past the small ambulance windows as Kendra cried out in agony, her grip on my fingers tightening with every single wave of blinding pain. I whispered to her constantly, promising her that she was finally safe and that those monsters would never touch her again. The ambulance slammed to a halt outside the emergency room entrance, and a team of federal doctors and nurses rushed out to meet us. They pulled her gurney from the back of the vehicle, completely bypassing the crowded waiting room and rushing her straight up to a secure maternity ward, entirely locked down by federal agents. I ran alongside her until we reached the double doors of the delivery suite, where a sympathetic nurse gently stopped me, telling me to wait outside while they stabilized her condition. I paced the sterile white hallway of the public hospital, my heart pounding fiercely against my ribs. I had barely been waiting for 20 minutes when the heavy elevator doors down the hall violently slid open. Stepping out into the harsh fluorescent light was Constance Sterling. She was entirely surrounded by a phalanx of at least 6 men wearing impeccable dark suits, carrying heavy leather briefcases. These were the $1,000 an hour corporate defense attorneys who did the dirty work for the Sterling Empire. Constance looked absolutely furious, her flawless blonde hair slightly out of place, her pale face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched down the hallway, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor, completely ignoring the federal agent standing guard near the delivery room doors. She marched straight toward the main nursing station, holding up a thick stack of heavily notarized legal documents. She slammed the papers down onto the tall counter, demanding that the hospital administrator be brought to her immediately. She announced in her cold, aristocratic voice that the woman currently giving birth in the secure suite was a legally contracted gestational carrier carrying the sole genetic heir of the Sterling family. Constance demanded that the second the infant was delivered, it must be immediately handed over to her legal team for transport to a private facility. She claimed my daughter had absolutely no maternal rights and was legally required to surrender the child under the strict surrogacy agreement signed months ago. The head nurse looked completely terrified by the sudden onslaught of expensive lawyers shouting legal jargon and threatening massive medical malpractice lawsuits if the hospital refused to comply with the contract. Constance turned her head and finally spotted me standing near the delivery suite doors. Her cold blue eyes narrowed with absolute venom. She walked slowly toward me, her army of expensive lawyers stepping back to give her space. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in absolute disgust at my dust-covered clothes. "You really thought you could win this?" She sneered, her voice low and dripping with sociopathic arrogance. "You thought a chaotic little federal raid would stop us from claiming what rightfully belongs to our family. That contract is ironclad in the state of Massachusetts, Nadine. The moment that baby takes its first breath, it belongs to me, and your pathetic daughter will be entirely forgotten." I stood my ground looking at this wealthy monster who had orchestrated the complete violation of my child. Constance felt entirely invincible, surrounded by her expensive lawyers, holding a piece of paper she thought made her a god. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute righteous fury settling deep into my bones. She honestly believed that her generational wealth and her team of expensive suits could completely override the basic human rights of the woman bleeding in the next room. She believed that her money allowed her to simply purchase human lives and discard the vessels whenever she pleased. She stood there smirking at me, entirely confident in her absolute supreme victory. I did not back away from her. I took a strong, deliberate step forward, invading her pristine personal space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "You are completely delusional, Constance," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You think that piece of paper means anything in a federal jurisdiction. You think your old money and your racist bloodline obsession give you the right to harvest minority women like cattle." Constance let out a short, bitter laugh, entirely unbothered by my accusations. "This has absolutely nothing to do with race, Nadine," she replied smoothly, her tone dripping with fake aristocratic politeness. "This is simply about preserving a legacy of excellence. My son deserved an heir with the proper genetic pedigree. We simply utilized your daughter because she provided a healthy, strong biological environment. It was a purely transactional medical arrangement. She should be incredibly grateful we even allowed her to carry a child of such immense value." My blood boiled at the sheer audacity of her monstrous words. "You stole her future!" I fired back, my voice rising, echoing down the sterile hospital corridor. "You drugged her against her will and implanted another woman inside her because you could never stomach the thought of a black woman legally sharing your family name. You are so terrified of losing your pure white legacy that you resorted to drugging, kidnapping, and premeditated murder just to keep your bloodline entirely untainted. You are not a prestigious Boston socialite, Constance. You are a disgusting sociopathic trafficker hiding behind a luxury designer suit." Constance's face flushed a deep, angry red, her perfect, wealthy facade finally cracking under the intense weight of the brutal truth. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a nobody," she hissed, her voice completely losing its refined edge. "I will bury you under so many legal injunctions you will never see the light of day again. That child is pure Sterling genetics and it belongs to us." Her lawyers began to step forward, sensing their wealthy client was losing her composure. The lead attorney opened his expensive leather briefcase, pulling out a fresh legal writ demanding immediate custody of the infant. He held it out toward me, telling me to step aside and let the legal process conclude. They really thought they had permanently won this massive entire legal war against our innocent family. Before the expensive corporate lawyer could take another step toward the delivery room, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open. Senior federal prosecutor Sarah strode powerfully down the corridor, flanked by 4 armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents. She walked right past the wall of stunned defense attorneys, ignoring their expensive suits and their frantic legal threats. She stepped right between me and Constance Sterling, holding a thick sealed document bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Constance glared at the prosecutor, demanding to know who she was and threatening to have her immediately fired by calling the state governor. Sarah did not even blink. She looked down at the wealthy socialite with an expression of absolute, profound disgust. She smoothly snatched the forged surrogacy agreement right out of Constance's pale hands. "That contract is not a legal custody document, Mrs. Sterling," Sarah said, her voice echoing with absolute, undeniable federal authority. "That contract is physical evidence of human trafficking and severe medical fraud. You orchestrated the illegal drugging and non-consensual surgical implantation of a federal witness." Constance opened her mouth to argue, to scream for her lawyers to fix the situation, but her expensive legal team was already backing away, entirely terrified by the massive federal racketeering warrants staring them right in the face. Sarah handed the thick warrant directly to Constance. "Constance Sterling, you are under formal arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, medical kidnapping, and running an illegal human trafficking enterprise," Sarah announced loudly. "You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you finally use it." 2 heavy tactical agents grabbed Constance roughly by her arms, twisting them forcefully behind her back and locking heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Constance screamed while they dragged her. The heavy double doors of the secure federal delivery suite slammed shut, completely cutting off the chaotic noise of the hallway where Constance Sterling was finally being arrested. Inside the bright, sterile room, the atmosphere was entirely focused and intensely desperate. A team of highly trained federal doctors and specialized neonatal nurses swarmed around Kendra's medical bed, moving with absolute frantic precision. The poisonous herbal tea Constance had forced my daughter to drink was an incredibly concentrated labor-inducing chemical designed to trigger a rapid, violent delivery. The dangerous drugs were ravaging her exhausted body, causing massive, overlapping, painful contractions. There was absolutely no natural rhythm to her agonizing labor. The violent artificial contractions were hitting her back to back without a single second of relief in between. I stood tightly by the head of the hospital bed, gripping her sweating hand with both of mine. Kendra threw her head back against the thin white hospital pillow, screaming a raw, guttural sound that tore completely through my own heart. Her beautiful face was pale and drenched in cold sweat, her body twisting wildly under the thin, blue cotton sheets. The digital heart monitors beeped frantically, filling the entire terrified room. The lead federal obstetrician, a kind older man with gentle eyes, stood at the foot of her bed, giving rapid, calm instructions to his dedicated medical team. He ordered an immediate intravenous line to flush the heavy toxins from her bloodstream and administer safe pain management medication. But the dangerous chemicals from the Sterling estate had already pushed her body entirely past the point of no medical return. The experienced doctor looked up at me, his expression incredibly grave, and told me the baby was coming right now. He said there was absolutely no time for any surgical intervention today. Kendra squeezed my fingers so incredibly hard I truly thought my fragile bones might actually snap. She was entirely consumed by a massive wave of blinding physical agony, but deep underneath the sheer terror and the immense physical pain, something incredibly powerful was beginning to fundamentally shift inside her exhausted mind. For the past 4 agonizing months, She had viewed the growing life inside her stomach as a terrifying foreign entity. It was a constant, horrific reminder of the brutal medical violation and the sociopathic betrayal inflicted upon her by the monstrous, manipulative, arrogant man she had once deeply loved. It was an illegal, unconsenting genetic hostage placed there by a wealthy, arrogant empire. But as the agonizing hours of brutal, grueling labor stretched endlessly on the cold, clinical reality of the forged surrogacy contracts completely faded away. Every single time a massive contraction ripped through her, tearing her body entirely apart, she felt the tiny, frantic movements of the baby fighting for survival, right alongside her. The loud, rapid thumping of the fetal heartbeat echoing loudly over the medical monitors became her sole powerful focus. The baby was entirely in distress, violently reacting to the dangerous artificial chemical drugs. The toxic chemicals were racing entirely through their shared circulatory bloodstream. The child was terrified and completely innocent in this massive, brutal family war. Kendra opened her tired, bloodshot eyes, looking desperately at the digital monitor displaying the rapid, tiny heartbeat. A fierce, overwhelming wave of absolute primal maternal protection suddenly washed over her entire trembling, broken body. She realized with absolute striking clarity that the child fighting for its life inside her was not a wealthy, arrogant Sterling. It was not a cold, calculating monster like Constance, or a sociopathic, pathetic, compulsive, devious, manipulative, terrible liar like Trenton tonight. It was just a tiny, vulnerable baby, completely dependent on her physical strength to survive the terrible night. She took a deep, ragged breath and completely stopped fighting the massive, overwhelming waves of intense pain. She leaned entirely into the terrifying agony, completely surrendering her broken body to the monumental task of delivering the child safely into the cold world. I watched a profound, miraculous physical transformation take over my beautiful, resilient daughter. She was no longer a terrified victim running blindly from a billionaire corporate crime family. She was an absolute warrior, a fierce, resilient, unstoppable, determined, protective mother. She was fighting a desperate, bloody battle on a sterile hospital bed. She pushed with every single ounce of physical strength she possessed, screaming loudly into the bright, sterile room as the federal doctors encouraged her to keep going. She was fighting intensely for her innocent baby. The immense physical toll was absolutely staggering to witness. Blood vessels burst entirely in her tired eyes, turning the whites a deep crimson red. Her chest heaved violently as she gasped desperately for the cool oxygen flowing from the clear plastic medical mask the nervous nurses had strapped securely over her sweaty face. I wiped her burning forehead with a damp cloth, whispering constant words of intense love and deep encouragement directly into her ear. I told her how incredibly proud I was of her massive, unyielding strength. I told her she was completely safe and the terrifying monsters could never reach her inside this secure room. With one final, massive, terrifying scream that seemed to completely shatter the very structural walls of the secure hospital room, Kendra gave one last incredible, desperate push. The blinding white delivery room suddenly fell into a heavy, absolute, agonizing, quiet silence for one terrifying, endless second. And then the most beautiful, miraculous sound in the entire world completely filled the sterile, empty space. A loud, sharp, piercing cry echoed brightly, bouncing happily off the cold medical equipment and the white tile walls. The baby had finally arrived, fighting loudly, and breathing the cold, clean hospital air completely free from his wealthy captors. The lead federal doctor caught the slippery, crying infant, quickly clearing his tiny airways with a small green rubber bulb. The tense room was instantly filled with a massive, beautiful wave of collective emotional relief. The skilled nurses moved with incredible, rapid, amazing speed. They were wrapping the crying baby tightly in warm, soft, white cotton blankets. I looked down at the tiny, fragile life that had just caused so much massive global destruction and heavy federal intervention. The baby was incredibly healthy and entirely vocal, But as the nurses wiped the newborn clean, the stark, absolute physical reality of the genetic betrayal became entirely and completely visible to everyone in the room. The newborn baby boy had a perfect head full of fine, straight, bright blonde hair. As he opened his tiny, swollen eyes to cry loudly, his irises were striking pale blue. He was the absolute, undeniable, perfect genetic replica of Trenton Sterling and Chloe Kensington. He looked absolutely nothing like the beautiful, strong black woman lying exhausted and bleeding on the delivery bed. The heavy, unspoken emotional tension in the bright room was incredibly palpable and suffocating. The federal nurses and the specialized doctors knew the entire horrific backstory of the massive illegal surrogacy trafficking case. They knew this tiny blonde infant was the biological product of a wealthy racist empire that had brutally violated the strong woman resting on the bed. They carefully wrapped the beautiful crying baby boy tonight. They held him slightly awkwardly near the metal medical tray. They collectively braced themselves, expecting Kendra to completely turn her head away in absolute, utter disgust. They fully expected her to reject the child entirely, to demand they take the genetic offspring of her terrible abusers completely out of her sight forever. The head nurse took a hesitant, cautious step forward, holding the tiny crying bundle very carefully in her arms. She looked at Kendra with deep, profound human sympathy, quietly asking if she wanted them to take the baby to the highly secure and entirely quiet neonatal hospital nursery. She offered to remove the child immediately so Kendra could finally rest and physically recover from the massive, horrific trauma. I held my breath, completely terrified of what my beautiful daughter might feel in this incredibly vulnerable, delicate moment. Kendra lay entirely exhausted against the flat pillows, her chest still heaving heavily, her body completely drained of all physical energy. She slowly turned her tired head, looking past the federal doctors and the complicated medical machines directly at the tiny blonde infant crying softly in the thick blanket. She did not look away in disgust. She did not scream angrily. She did not demand they remove him from the quiet room. A soft, incredibly beautiful, warm smile slowly spread across her tired, bruised face. She reached her shaking, exhausted arms out toward the hesitant federal nurse. "Give him to me," Kendra whispered, her voice completely hoarse and incredibly weak, but filled with absolute, undeniable maternal authority. The surprised nurse quickly stepped forward and gently placed the warm, tightly wrapped infant directly onto Kendra's bare chest. The absolute second the tiny baby felt the familiar, comforting warmth of her skin, his loud, frantic crying completely stopped. He was finally completely safe. 6 months passed since the terrifying night my grandson was born. We named him Leo. He was a beautiful, happy baby boy with bright blonde hair and striking blue eyes. Despite the horrific genetic reality of his conception, Kendra loved him with a fierce, absolute devotion. She was his mother in every single way that truly mattered. We used the massive federal victim compensation funds to purchase a beautiful, secure home far away from the dark shadows of Boston. But the massive federal war against the Sterling family was far from over. It all culminated in what the national media officially dubbed the healthcare trial of the decade. The massive federal courthouse was completely surrounded by news vans, reporters, and angry protesters demanding absolute justice for the dozens of minority women the Sterlings had ruthlessly violated. I walked into the crowded, massive courtroom holding my daughter's hand tightly. We took our seats right behind the heavy wooden prosecutor table. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung violently open, and a collective gasp completely filled the massive room. Trenton and Constance Sterling walked slowly down the center aisle, entirely flanked by heavy federal marshals. The incredibly wealthy, untouchable Boston billionaires were completely stripped of their designer suits and their expensive silk dresses. They were wearing standard-issue bright orange federal prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound tightly by heavy steel chains, clinking loudly against the polished marble floor. Constance looked absolutely pale and entirely haggard, her previously flawless blonde hair now completely gray and completely unkempt. Trenton looked completely exhausted, but his cold blue eyes still held a lingering spark of arrogant sociopathic defiance. He looked across the massive courtroom and locked eyes with Kendra, staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Kendra did not look away or flinch under his terrifying gaze. She sat perfectly tall, holding her head incredibly high, completely projecting the absolute unyielding strength of a fearless mother. The massive trial lasted for 3 grueling, agonizing weeks. The federal prosecutor, Sarah, systematically dismantled the entire Sterling medical empire brick by expensive brick. She paraded a massive line of devastated victims, wealthy, corrupt doctors, and terrified clinic administrators right across the witness stand. Dr. Naomi Hayes delivered a highly emotional, powerful testimony detailing the exact, horrific moment she discovered the hidden gestational carrier file. The federal cyber agents presented the massive offshore wire transfers, proving Constance had purchased Chloe Kensington genetic material for $500,000. But the absolute climax of the massive trial centered entirely on the legal custody of baby Leo. Trenton expensive defense attorneys had one final desperate, entirely disgusting legal strategy. They were trying to completely rip my beautiful grandson away from the only loving mother he had ever known. The lead defense attorney, a tall, arrogant man wearing a custom-tailored suit, stood confidently before the strict federal judge. He began to deliver his massive closing argument, pacing slowly across the polished courtroom floor. He pointed directly at my daughter to deliver his final blow. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked directly at the packed jury box. He told the silent courtroom that despite the highly unfortunate medical misunderstandings, the fundamental biological facts remained completely undeniable. He claimed the entire case hinged on one simple, undeniable genetic truth. The child in question shared absolutely zero biological connection to the woman claiming to be his mother. He stated that biology was the ultimate legal authority and asked the judge to recognize the true genetic parents. The silent room waited for the prosecutor to finally respond. The defense attorney continued his disgusting argument, relying entirely on the cold, hard science of human genetics. He reminded the judge that the newborn baby was the direct biological product of Trenton Sterling and Chloe Kensington. He argued that because Kendra provided absolutely no genetic material, she was merely a temporary physical vessel, a biological incubator, who had absolutely no legal right to claim the child. He demanded that all permanent parental rights be immediately transferred back to Trenton and Chloe, asserting that the baby belonged entirely with his true genetic family. He completely ignored the massive trauma, the drugging, the kidnapping, and the horrifying forged documents. He simply stood there trying to use science to justify a violent human rights violation. Kendra gripped my hand, her palms completely slick with cold sweat. The thought of losing Leo to the monsters who had tortured her was entirely unbearable. But senior federal prosecutor Sarah was entirely prepared for this disgusting legal maneuver. She stood up from the heavy wooden table, her expression completely filled with absolute righteous authority. She walked powerfully to the center of the courtroom, holding the original forged surrogacy contract high in the air for the entire room to clearly see. She turned directly toward the defense table, her voice echoing loudly across the silent room. She stated that the defense was deliberately trying to completely ignore the massive violent felonies that brought this child into the world. Sarah brilliantly argued that the surrogacy contract was a completely illegal forged document created during the commission of a federal crime. Because the contract was entirely fraudulent and signed without informed medical consent, it was entirely void under the law. She then delivered the absolute ultimate legal payload that completely destroyed the Sterling family defense. She opened a thick legal textbook and read directly from the state Supreme Court medical statutes. She proved that in the absence of a legally binding and fully consensual surrogacy contract, the absolute legal rights revert entirely to the woman who physically carried and delivered the child. She stated that birth mother rights completely supersede all genetic claims when the conception was the direct result of medical fraud and severe physical violation. Kendra was the absolute undisputed legal birth mother. Sarah did not stop there. She completely went on the absolute offensive, systematically destroying any remaining biological claims Trenton and Chloe thought they possessed. she presented the massive criminal indictments against both biological contributors. Chloe Kensington had already formally pleaded guilty to massive financial fraud and illegal conspiracy to commit severe medical abuse. Trenton was currently facing decades in federal prison for organizing a massive human trafficking operation and severe child endangerment. Sarah firmly stated that federal law completely and automatically strips all parental rights from individuals convicted of such horrific violent felonies against a child and its legal birth mother. They were completely unfit, dangerous criminals who had permanently forfeited their rights the exact second they drugged an innocent woman. The massive courtroom was entirely silent as Sarah dismantled the arrogant billionaires using their own legal system against them. Trenton's face turned a sickening shade of pale gray, realizing his massive, expensive legal team could not buy his way out of this absolute disaster. Constance buried her face in her shackled hands, weeping loudly in complete defeat. The brilliant prosecutor looked directly at the strict federal judge, requesting that full, permanent, exclusive legal custody of the infant be immediately granted to Kendra. She stated that my daughter was the only person in the entire world who had shown the child genuine, unconditional maternal love. The strict federal judge, an older man with no patience for arrogance, leaned forward over his massive wooden bench. He looked down at the evidence, the forged contracts, the offshore wire transfers, and the chilling pre-written death certificate. He then looked directly at Trenton and Constance sitting in their bright orange jumpsuits, stripped of their worldly power. He declared that in his 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed such profound sociopathic evil orchestrated by people who believed their money made them above the law. He ruled that the forged surrogacy contract was legally void. He formally recognized Kendra as the sole legal mother of the child, permanently stripping Trenton and Chloe of any parental rights. He struck the gavel loudly, granting full, permanent, exclusive custody entirely to my daughter. Kendra collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing loudly with absolute profound joy and total relief. The massive courtroom erupted into loud cheering and applause from the gallery. The judge then turned his fierce gaze upon Trenton. He sentenced Trenton Sterling to serve exactly 25 years in a maximum security federal prison without any possibility of early parole. He sentenced Constance to 20 years for her role in the conspiracy. The absolute second the judge finalized the heavy sentence, Trenton completely snapped. The wealthy, untouchable billionaire completely lost his mind. He lunged violently toward the prosecutor table, screaming hysterically, thrashing wildly against the heavy steel chains binding his wrists and ankles. "You cannot do this to me!" he screamed, his face turning a dark, violent purple. "He is my son. He belongs to me." Heavy federal marshals immediately tackled him violently to the cold marble floor. They dragged him forcefully out of the courtroom while he kicked and screamed like a feral, terrified animal, completely broken and permanently defeated. The heavy slam of the federal judge's gavel did not just end the trial, it shattered the foundations of the Sterling family empire. Within 1 day of the final verdict, the federal government launched a massive, coordinated seizure of every single asset tied to the Sterling Medical Group. I stood on the sidewalk outside their flagship clinic in downtown Boston, watching with immense satisfaction as federal agents placed heavy steel padlocks on the pristine glass doors. The massive silver letters spelling out their prestigious name were violently pried off the brick facade by government contractors, completely erasing their toxic legacy from the city skyline. But simply shutting down the fraudulent clinics was never going to be enough for me or the Justice Department. Because of my 30 years of dedicated service as a forensic federal accountant and my intimate, undeniable knowledge of their financial labyrinth, the state attorney general formally appointed me as the special master of liquidation. It was my absolute honor to personally dismantle the billionaire syndicate piece by piece. I spent the next 4 months sitting in a secure federal office, systematically liquidating their massive real estate portfolios, their private offshore trust funds, and their luxury vehicles. Every single dollar they had hoarded through generational wealth and criminal exploitation was completely stripped away and transferred into a massive federal restitution fund. But the most important part of my new job had absolutely nothing to do with punishing the wealthy monsters. It had everything to do with saving their innocent victims. I used the decrypted digital files from Project Vessel to personally track down the 40 other minority women who had been secretly violated by the Sterling clinics. These were young college students, hardworking mothers, and poor young women who thought they were simply receiving standard charitable medical care. They had absolutely no idea they were carrying and delivering children for wealthy white socialites. I arranged private, highly secure meetings with every single one of them, sitting across from these incredibly brave, resilient women and explaining the horrific truth of what had been done to their bodies was the hardest thing I have ever had to personally do. Many of them wept uncontrollably, entirely devastated by the massive betrayal of the doctors they completely trusted. But I did not just bring them terrible news. I brought them absolute financial justice and the unwavering support of the federal government. I handed each of these beautiful, strong women a certified federal bank draft for exactly $5 million. It was a massive slice of the liquidated Sterling fortune legally awarded to them for their severe physical and emotional suffering. I watched tearful, exhausted mothers realize they could finally buy safe homes for their actual families, pay off their crushing student loans, and completely reclaim their stolen independence. We also provided them with therapists and medical care to help them process the severe trauma. Seeing the Sterling family dirty money being completely repurposed to permanently elevate and empower the marginalized women they had actively tried to exploit was the ultimate poetic justice. While I was busy entirely redistributing their massive wealth, Constance Sterling was slowly losing her mind inside a federal minimum security prison in Connecticut. She had spent her entire arrogant life draped in custom silk designer dresses, attending elite country club galas, and ordering servants around her massive luxury estate. Now she was forced to wear a scratchy, oversized khaki prison uniform and sleep alone on a thin, lumpy mattress inside a tiny, cold concrete cell. She had absolutely zero special privileges and zero powerful friends to help her. The other female inmates did not care about her prestigious Boston bloodline or her vast historical family wealth. To them, she was just another convicted criminal taking up space in the crowded cafeteria line. During her first few weeks, Constance tried to act like a strict, wealthy warden, constantly demanding to speak to the manager and complaining loudly about the terrible quality of the powdered eggs and the burnt coffee. She threatened to sue the guards, claiming her delicate constitution required bottled water and organic meals. The guards simply laughed in her face and locked her inside her cold, quiet cell. The absolute total loss of her societal power completely broke her fragile, arrogant psyche. Without her massive bank accounts and her terrifying influence to shield her from the real world, Constance rapidly deteriorated. She stopped brushing her fading gray hair and began pacing the small prison yard, muttering endlessly to herself about her stolen legacy and her ruined, perfect grandson. She completely lost her grip on reality, entirely unable to process the massive consequences of her own sociopathic actions. Every single time I received a routine federal update on her pathetic declining mental status, I felt absolutely zero pity. She was simply reaping the exact terrifying nightmare she had so casually inflicted upon my beautiful daughter. But Constance and Trenton were not the only ones whose lives were completely destroyed by their sickening arrogance. Chloe Kensington, the wealthy blonde socialite who had happily paid $500,000 to avoid the physical burden of pregnancy, faced a completely different kind of devastating prison. Because she had immediately cooperated with the federal prosecutors and turned over massive amounts of evidence against the Sterling family, Chloe managed to avoid serving a lengthy prison sentence. The judge ordered her to pay massive federal fines and serve 5 years of strict home confinement. But her public life was entirely ruined forever. The explosive federal trial had been completely broadcast across national television networks, and the entire world learned exactly what she had done. The public backlash was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Chloe became the ultimate national face of elite, wealthy white privilege and racial exploitation. Her face was plastered across every single major news channel and viral social media platform. The exclusive high society circles she had always desperately clung to completely abandoned her overnight. The country clubs permanently revoked her memberships. Her powerful friends immediately blocked her phone number, entirely terrified of being publicly associated with a convicted human trafficker. The massive charitable foundation her family had run for decades was completely boycotted by angry donors, eventually forcing them to shut their prestigious doors forever. The absolute worst blow to Chloe's enormous fragile ego came when her wealthy fiancé broke off their engagement. He released a harsh public statement entirely condemning her monstrous actions and canceling their lavish $1 million wedding. Chloe was forced to hide inside her family's massive empty mansion, entirely isolated and despised by the entire world. She could not even scroll through her phone without seeing thousands of angry comments calling her a disgusting monster. She had arrogantly tried to buy a child like a luxury designer handbag, and it cost her absolutely everything she valued in her pathetic life. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in my secure federal office, signing the final liquidation documents. I looked at the massive stack representing the complete structural annihilation of the Sterling Medical Group. The billions of dollars they had built upon the hidden suffering of innocent, vulnerable women was entirely gone, redistributed to the actual victims who truly deserved it. I placed my gold federal pen gently down on the polished wooden desk, feeling a massive, overwhelming sense of absolute peace wash over my weary soul. I had spent 30 long years fighting massive corporate corruption, but this specific case was the absolute crowning achievement of my proud professional career. I did not just balance a ledger or expose a simple tax fraud. I completely burned down a dangerous, evil empire that had preyed upon the beautiful, strong women of my community. I grabbed my black leather jacket and walked proudly out of the large federal building, breathing in the crisp, cool Boston air. I drove my new sedan through the busy city streets, heading toward the beautiful, safe suburban neighborhood where my daughter and grandson were currently living. The dark, terrifying shadows that had completely surrounded our family for the past year were finally entirely lifted. We had walked directly through the absolute fires of hell, and we had emerged completely victorious. I pulled into Kendra's long driveway, smiling warmly as I saw her sitting peacefully on the wide front porch. She was gently rocking baby Leo in her arms, the bright afternoon sun illuminating her beautiful, shining face. As I walked up the wooden stairs toward them, I knew the Sterling family would never cast a dark shadow over this beautiful child life. They were permanently locked away, trapped in the horrific, miserable prisons they had completely built for themselves through their own arrogant greed. Kendra looked up at me, her eyes filled with absolute, pure, radiant happiness. She gently handed the sleeping baby into my waiting arms, and I held him incredibly close to my beating heart. The evil medical empire was completely destroyed, but our beautiful, loving family was just beginning to truly heal and thrive. Exactly 1 year has passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal courthouse closed on the Sterling family forever. The brisk autumn wind is blowing gently through the massive oak trees surrounding our beautiful new home. We live far away from the dark, suffocating shadows of Boston now. We used the massive federal victim compensation settlement to purchase a sprawling, incredibly beautiful private estate in upstate New York. It sits quietly on 50 acres of lush green land, completely surrounded by a tall, secure stone wall and heavy iron gates that we control entirely. There are no hidden security cameras monitoring our every single move, and absolutely no manipulative billionaires trying to dictate our daily lives. The air up here smells like fresh pine needles and absolute total freedom. I am standing quietly on the wraparound wooden porch, holding a warm mug of sweet tea. I look out across the massive manicured back lawn and watch my beautiful daughter sitting peacefully in a wide wooden rocking chair. The bright afternoon sunlight is catching the warm, rich tones of her glowing brown skin. Kendra looks incredibly healthy and entirely radiant. The dark, heavy circles of absolute terror that haunted her exhausted eyes for so many agonizing months have completely faded away. She is wearing a soft, comfortable yellow sundress, and her long, dark hair is blowing gently in the cool autumn breeze. She is completely relaxed, humming a soft, beautiful melody. Resting securely against her chest, completely wrapped in a soft white blanket, is my 1-year-old grandson Leo. He is a perfectly healthy, incredibly happy baby boy with bright blonde hair and striking pale blue eyes. He is the absolute, undeniable genetic replica of the wealthy people who tried to destroy us. But when Leo looks up at Kendra, he does not see a biological vessel or a temporary medical incubator. He sees his entire world. He reaches his tiny, pale hands up and grabs a lock of her dark hair, laughing a bright, joyful sound that echoes happily across the massive green lawn. Kendra smiles down at him, her eyes filled with absolute, pure, unconditional maternal love. She kisses his soft forehead and whispers quiet, gentle words of encouragement that make him giggle even louder. There is absolutely no hesitation or lingering resentment in her gentle touch. She fought an incredible, violent, terrifying war to bring this innocent child safely into the world, and she loves him with a fierce, absolute devotion that genetic biology could never possibly dictate or understand. He is her beautiful son in every single meaningful way that truly matters in this life. The massive federal settlement we received after the complete liquidation of the Sterling Medical Group was absolutely staggering. The government awarded my daughter tens of millions of dollars in punitive damages for the severe medical trauma and the illegal human trafficking she endured. We did not just use that dirty money to buy this beautiful, peaceful sanctuary. Kendra established a massive, powerful legal foundation dedicated entirely to helping and protecting vulnerable minority women who have been exploited by the corrupt private medical industry. She uses the stolen Sterling family fortune to hire the best attorneys in the country to fight for women who have absolutely no voice. She completely transformed her horrific personal tragedy into a massive beacon of incredible hope and powerful systemic change. The wealth that was meant to crush us is now actively dismantling the very corrupt systems that empowered our wealthy abusers. I take a slow sip of my warm tea and walk slowly down the wooden porch steps toward the bright green lawn. The dry autumn leaves crunch softly beneath my shoes as I approach my daughter and my beautiful grandson. Leo spots me walking toward them and immediately waves his tiny arms, letting out a happy, excited squeal. I smile warmly and reach out carefully, lifting his warm, heavy little body from Kendra's arms. He rests his head comfortably against my shoulder, his bright blue eyes looking at me with absolute total trust and profound innocence. I hold him incredibly close, breathing in the soft, sweet scent of baby lotion and fresh air. I look at Kendra, and we share a long, quiet, knowing look. We do not need to speak any words to completely understand the massive, incredible weight of what we have accomplished together. As I stand there holding this beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby boy, the sheer absolute massive irony of the entire situation washes completely over me. Constance Sterling and her arrogant sociopathic son committed unspeakable, horrific crimes. They orchestrated massive medical fraud, kidnapped a federal witness, and actively planned a brutal murder, all because they were completely terrified of tainting their prestigious historic family lineage. They wanted to ensure an absolutely pure white bloodline to inherit their massive medical empire and carry on their wealthy aristocratic legacy. They viewed black women as nothing more than disposable medical tools meant to serve their supreme genetic desires. They spent millions of dollars trying to buy the perfect biological heir, completely bypassing the woman Trenton actually married just to maintain their twisted, deeply racist societal purity. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated the ultimate silent, invisible domestic crime. But their monstrous, terrifying plan backfired in the most spectacular, absolute, permanent way imaginable. Their massive medical empire is completely destroyed and completely liquidated by the federal government. Their pristine, historic reputation is forever ruined, and their powerful family name is now synonymous with absolute human evil. Trenton is sitting alone in a maximum security federal prison cell, surrounded by cold concrete walls, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his immense corporate power. Constance is slowly losing her fragile mind inside a minimum security facility, eating terrible food and wearing cheap, scratchy uniforms, completely forgotten by her wealthy society friends. They lost absolutely everything they valued in this world. And the absolute ultimate devastating punishment for their profound racist arrogance is the incredibly poetic reality of who is currently raising their sole, precious genetic heir. They handed their entire legacy directly over to us. The pristine, pure white baby boy they broke every single law to create is now being legally, permanently, and incredibly lovingly raised by two strong, resilient black women. Leo will never know the cold, sociopathic, aristocratic environment of the massive Sterling estate. He will never be taught to view other human beings as disposable property or lesser genetic vessels. He will grow up in this warm, beautiful home surrounded by deep, unconditional love, intense empathy, and absolute profound respect. He will be raised to understand the immense value of incredible, strong women who fight fiercely for justice. We are completely erasing the toxic Sterling legacy with every single hug, every single bedtime story, and every single bright, joyful laugh. We took the broken pieces of their terrible, violent crime and built a beautiful, thriving, loving family completely out of their permanent, agonizing ruin. I gently rock Leo back and forth, feeling his tiny, steady heartbeat pulsing warmly against my own chest. I look back at my daughter, who has completely reclaimed her entire beautiful life. She is absolutely no longer a victim trapped in a terrifying gilded cage. She is a massive, powerful, unstoppable force of nature, a true modern matriarch who completely defeated a billionaire crime family through her immense courage and sheer absolute willpower. We survived the absolute darkest, terrifying chapters of our entire lives because we refused to ever surrender our dignity or our absolute profound truth. Every single tear we shed during those horrible dark nights has finally blossomed into absolute, total, radiant joy. We are no longer hiding in the shadows of their cruel, wicked manipulation. We are standing completely tall in the bright, warm light of our incredible victory. We stood our ground against the wealthy, corrupt monsters, and we watched their massive golden empire completely burn to the ground. We absolutely proved that no amount of generational wealth or powerful political connections can ever defeat the incredible, unwavering strength of a truly united family. They tried to use my daughter as a vessel, but they forgot one thing. You don't mess with a mother's instinct, and you damn sure don't mess with an auditor's paper trail. Have you ever had to legally destroy someone who tried to ruin your family? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more. If you ever find yourself entirely surrounded by manipulative people who think their power makes them completely untouchable, I want you to remember this story. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small or completely powerless. Gather your evidence plan, your absolute escape, and strike back with everything you have. Your peace and your beautiful family are always worth the fight. Hit that like button, share this powerful story with someone who needs incredible strength today, and please subscribe to the channel for more absolutely true and powerful stories of survival.